in a time of desert winds and moonlit gardens, when empires were carved not only in stone but in story, there lived a princess who never raised her voice, and a poet who had nothing but his. This is not a tale of war or crowns. It is the quiet murmur beneath the silk curtain, the ink that stains a palm by candlelight, the trembling breath before a name is spoken aloud. You may not remember your own dreams from last night, but I promise you, hers were made of jasmine. She was the daughter of kings, and though her name was known in every courtyard, her voice lived only inside her. There were expectations braided into her hair, duty stitched into every hem of her robe, and beyond the colonnades of her quiet world, past the carved archways of her family's library, a poet waited, not noble by birth, but noble by heart. He wore no fine linen, but in his hands, the brush trembled like a secret, each stroke a whisper from another life. He had read too many old books, and fallen in love too easily, with a girl who barely knew his name. But what is love if not a kind of brave forgetting? Forgetting who you are, and remembering only who you feel drawn toward, in the quietest part of you. Every day, he slipped poems into the cracks of the sandstone wall, tucked them into scrolls she might find, while pretending to study astronomy. He never signed them. That was the part she loved most. His words? Soft fires, gentle storms, stories written like sighs. In the shadow of your eyes, he wrote, the sun forgets its duties, and I forget mine. They never spoke aloud. No glances stolen in corridors, no brushes of hands in the courtyard, but every poem was a thread, pulling her further from the world she knew. She read them by candlelight, alone, her breath catching like a bird in a net, and slowly, in the space between silence and longing, she fell in love, not with a face, but with a voice. He didn't know, and yet, he must have known. But kingdoms do not stop for poetry. Arrangements were made, suitors were summoned, and the poet was exiled. His last words, written in a scroll she almost didn't open, "If I return," it read, "I will wear no crown, seek no reward. I only ask that once. Once, you whisper my name into the wind." They say she did, every dawn, before the palace awoke. Just a name, barely more than breath. But even the desert listens. When love speaks, and maybe, just maybe, that wind still carries his name through alleys of jasmine and ink. So now, as your body softens, as the weight of today melts away, ask yourself, who have you loved in silence? Whose name still rests beneath your ribs? Like a poem no one was ever meant to read, let this story be a hush in your chest, a soft ache that reminds you, even behind the highest walls, even beneath the weight of centuries, love finds a way to leave its mark, even if it's only in a letter no one was ever supposed to find. Now, let us begin with the next chapter. A Roman soldier's last letter to his beloved. He was not born a soldier. He was born beneath olive trees, where the soil was warm and the air smelled of thyme. Before the empire claimed him, he belonged to a quiet village, to a mother who sang while kneading bread, to a father who never spoke of war, and to a girl who laughed like spring rain. Her name was Livia, and in the years before blood and bronze, he carved it into the bark of the fig tree, where they used to meet at dusk. You would not have known he was meant for battle, not with hands made for holding rather than harm. But the empire asks not what a man desires, only what he can endure. So he went to Gaul, to the edge of the world, with sword and standard, with stories of valor forced into his spine, and with her name, pressed like a prayer, beneath his tongue. He wrote to her every fortnight, letters that smelled of wax and dust, sometimes stained with rain, sometimes with something redder. She read them beneath the same fig tree, her fingers tracing the parts where the ink had faded. He told her of rivers that ran like veins across the land, of moons that rose unfamiliar and pale, of comrades who sang lullabies before sleep, as if to remember they were once children. He told her of missing her, of missing the way she hummed, while tying her hair with ribbon, of how quiet the world felt, without her laughter, to hold it together. "My dearest Livia," he once wrote, "the night falls differently here. The stars feel colder, as if they belonged to someone else." He never told her how many times he almost didn't return, from the line between breath and blade. He never told her how he cried once, just once, when he saw a flower that looked like the ones she used to tuck behind her ear. You see, even warriors ache. And then, on the eve of what they called a final push, he wrote one last letter. It was shorter than the rest, but heavier. "Livia, if this finds you, know that I was thinking of your hands when the horn sounded, that I was not afraid, that in my final thought, I was not a soldier. I was yours, only yours." He died with that letter unfinished. A comrade folded it carefully, sealed it with trembling fingers, and sent it home with the kind of silence only death can teach. Livia received it 1 month later. By then, the fig tree had begun to dry. The village had started calling her the one who waits. She never married, never stopped walking the same path, from her home to the tree, every evening, as if he might return. From the edge of history, some say she buried the letter beneath its roots, so the tree would remember. And tonight, as you close your eyes and feel the weight of all that was unsaid in your own life, remember this: some loves do not end. They echo through trees and letters, through bloodlines and dreams, through silence. Not all stories are meant to be rewritten. Some are meant to be felt, fully, softly, endlessly. Now, let your breath slow, let your memories dissolve, and ask yourself, who waits for you in the quiet? And if no one does, perhaps you are the one who has always done the waiting. Now let us begin with the next chapter, a merchant's secret romance on the Silk Road. The wind on the Silk Road was unlike any other. It carried stories, woven into grains of sand, folded into the tassels of worn carpets, whispered in languages half remembered and half invented by lovers who had no need for translation. In that endless stretch between empires, where stars seemed to draw their own maps, there once walked a merchant with calloused feet and soft eyes. His name has long been lost to time, but his story, it lingers. He traded in silks, spices, and carved jade, but what he carried most were memories. Memories tucked between bolts of fabric, scents of clove and cinnamon, that reminded him of her. She was not a customer. She was a chance. It began in Samarkand, when the moon was low and the market was humming. She sold ink and paper, scrolls dyed with pomegranate skin, lined with gentle poetry and questions without answers. Her stall was tucked between a calligrapher and a man who claimed to bottle dreams. She believed neither one nor the other, but she believed in him. Not at first, of course. At first, he was only another passing soul, another man with a story to tell, and hands that reached too quickly. But he never reached. Not for her, only for her words. She caught him one evening, reading a line she had written herself. "The road does not end," it said. "It only folds into the heart." He asked her what it meant. She asked him what he hoped it did. That was their beginning. They never spoke of love, but it hung in the air like incense, something unseen, but unmistakably present. He stayed longer than merchants usually did, returned more often than was practical, every time, bringing something small. A carved elephant, a vial of oil that smelled like the ocean, a mirror polished so perfectly. It reflected the soul more than the face. In return, she gave him words, fragments of verses, tiny books no bigger than a palm, and once, a blank scroll. "For what you have not yet said, she told him. He never kissed her, never asked her to leave her stall, her city, her life. He knew better. Some loves are not meant to be caged. They are meant to roam, like wind or sand or caravans. So instead, they created rituals. Tea, shared in silence at dawn. A stone passed between palms, as if it could hold memory. A phrase, in a made-up tongue, that meant, I will remember this moment forever, even when I pretend not to. But trade routes pull people like tides, and the road eventually calls back. Those who once tried to rest too long. He left in spring. She gave him one final gift, a satchel filled with paper and one instruction. Write to me, even if you never send it. He did, on the cliffs near the Taklamakan, in candlelight at caravanserais, under stars too numerous to name. He wrote of dreams where they aged together, of lives they'd never live, of the way her silence sometimes felt louder than any voice. He never returned, not because he didn't want to, but because he was not meant to. The road changes those who follow it, and sometimes it erases the path behind them. But she waited, not like a woman trapped in time, but like one who understood it. She kept his letters, unsent and unwritten, in a box he had once admired, and every year, on the day the wind blew just right, she would unfold a blank page and read it like scripture. They were never lovers, but they loved. Isn't that its own kind of story? Now, as you drift deeper, as the soft rustle of dreams begins to rise behind your eyelids, consider this. Have you ever loved someone in a way that words couldn't hold? Have you ever held a moment so sacred you never dared speak of it aloud? Let this tale settle in your chest, not like sorrow, but like wonder. Because not all stories are about endings. Some are simply about the fact that they happened at all. And that is enough. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Forbidden love in the Ottoman court. In the heart of the empire, where the sun touched gold domes and marble courtyards, and where the scent of rosewater lingered in every corridor, there was a silence too delicate to name. The Ottoman palace, a place of grandeur. Yes, but also of secrets, tucked behind lattice windows and beneath the folds of silk robes. Every hallway echoed with power, and yet, beneath it all, there were the heartbeats of those who loved in shadows. Among them, a concubine and a scholar. She was known as Layla of the Garden, for she had once spent every afternoon tending to the jasmine vines behind the harem. Her beauty was not loud, not the kind that made men forget themselves, but the kind that made poets forget how to write anything else. He was Yusuf, a tutor in the palace school, a man with ink-stained fingers and the kind of eyes that always seemed to be looking through time itself. He taught the sons of pashas, lecturing on ancient philosophy and astronomy, yet never once mentioned the only mystery that truly consumed him. Her. They were not meant to know each other. She lived in a world of veils and rules, and he in a world of scrolls and solitude. But the empire, for all its order, could not stop what grows in silence. Their story began with a book. She found it one morning, abandoned on the steps of the fountain, leather-bound, weathered, its title nearly erased by time. Inside, a note. To the one who finds this, may you discover yourself in its pages. She read it every night, hidden beneath her blanket, tracing each line with a fingertip, memorizing verses about stars and the soul. When she returned it a week later, he was waiting. No words passed between them, only a glance. And in that single glance, an entire future bloomed, that neither could dare speak aloud. So began a ritual. Books passed hand to hand, always with notes tucked inside. Never names, just thoughts, questions, wishes. Do you believe love can exist where freedom cannot? What is more dangerous, silence or the truth? If I were not who I am, and you not who you are, would you stay? It wasn't touch. It wasn't even voice. But it was everything. She began writing poems. He began folding them into books. And though they never met in private, they began to feel more known by one another than by anyone else they had ever encountered. Until one day, a poem went missing. It had fallen into the wrong hands. A jealous guard. A suspicious eunuch. History doesn't remember who, but it remembers what happened next. The court whispered. Punishments were discussed. The walls, once warm with secrets, turned cold with watchfulness. She was moved to another wing. He was reassigned to a distant post, teaching strategy to bored generals. Their books stopped appearing. Their notes dissolved into absence. And in time, their story should have disappeared altogether. But one thing remained. A small sculpture. A bird. Carved from ivory. Placed quietly in the garden where she once walked. No one knew where it had come from. No one touched it. Except her. Every morning, she passed it with her fingers grazing its wings. And each evening, the bird would face a slightly different direction, as if it, too, had become a messenger between two broken hearts, still learning how to speak through silence. Years passed. The court changed. New sultans, new stories. But the bird remained. And beneath it, eventually, someone found a final note. If you still walk these gardens, know this. I would have given up every title, every book, every name I was ever called, for 1 hour beside you, with no fear and no walls. She never responded. Some say she was married off. Others say she vanished, perhaps escaped in the chaos of palace intrigue. But the note was folded 7 times. 7, the number of completion, of promises, of eternity. And maybe that's what this was. Not a story of endings, but of what survives, even when everything else is taken. Now, as your breath grows long, as the palace gates close in your dreaming mind, consider this. What have you loved that you could never name? What glances changed your life, even when no one else noticed? Sometimes, the forbidden is not dangerous because it is wrong, but because it reveals what is most right, in a world too afraid to see it. And sometimes, the greatest loves are not those that last, but those that awaken something in us we thought would never live. Let this story settle like incense in the corners of your memory. Let it whisper in the hallways of your chest. There are still gardens where love grows, even if no one is allowed to enter. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The last dance of a samurai's wife. In the snow-covered stillness of feudal Japan, where bamboo bent in silence, and lantern light flickered like memory, there lived a woman whose love story was written in movements, rather than words. Her name was Akiko. She was the wife of a samurai, a man whose honor stood taller than his shadow, and whose silence was the only thing louder than his presence. Their love was not loud. It did not burn like fire. It moved like water, slow, sure, quietly shaping every stone it touched. They married young, not from passion, but from arrangement. And yet, as years passed, what began in obedience grew into devotion. He never spoke much. He left at dawn, trained by day, returned by dusk. But each evening, she would wait with tea prepared, 2 cups placed between them, like a ritual of care. She did not speak unless spoken to, but her eyes told stories that only he could read. He would nod. She would smile, and in that small gesture, they built a quiet world, far stronger than steel. But empires are always at war, and men who carry swords seldom sleep in the same bed for long. One winter, he was called to the north. A conflict, a rebellion, something that required both blade and loyalty. Before he left, he handed her a folded paper crane, made by his hands, Rough, imprecise, but real. "If I return," he whispered, "we will dance again." She had only danced once, on their wedding night. A traditional movement, elegant, still, like poetry told through breath. He had watched her that night, with the eyes of a man who suddenly realizes what life could be if it were not bound by duty. And now, that promise hung in the air, like snowflakes refusing to land. She waited. Days passed, then weeks. Seasons folded into each other, like the pages of a forgotten poem. No letters came. No word. Only silence. Still, every evening, she laid out 2 cups of tea. She spoke to no one of her fear. She wept only when the house slept, and by morning, her hands would once again be calm. Then, on the first day of spring, his blade was returned to her, alone, wrapped in white, bound with thread. No message, no explanation, but she knew what it meant. That night, she opened her old kimono chest, pulled out the silks she had not worn. Since that first dance, she lit the lamps, moved aside the table, and danced, not for ceremony, not for tradition, but for memory. Each motion was a conversation she never got to have. Each turn, a question unanswered. She did not cry. The dance was her mourning, and her offering, and her rebellion. "I told you," she whispered into the wind. "We would dance again." And some say, in that final movement, she smiled, because even grief can be beautiful when it is love, disguised. Now, as you lay still beneath your blanket of dreams, let Akiko's story wash over you gently. Let it remind you that not all love must be spoken aloud. Sometimes, it's enough to remember, to prepare the tea, to wait, to dance, even when no one is watching. And when you do, some part of them always returns. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. A Pharaoh's Promise, Under the Egyptian Stars. Long before the pyramids were weathered by sand and time, before the names of kings faded from stone, there was a promise, spoken not in temples, but beneath the stars. He was Pharaoh, beloved of Ra, ruler of 2 lands. But even kings are not immune to the hunger of the heart. Her name was Neferet. She was no queen, no noble consort. She came from the river villages, where the Nile flowed like a slow lullaby, and women sang as they worked with sun-warmed hands. She came to the palace as a healer, called for her rare knowledge of herbs, of roots that calmed pain, of flowers that soothed fevered dreams. He noticed her not for beauty, though she had that too, but for her silence, for the way she listened, as though each word was sacred, for the way her hands knew what to do, before anyone could speak. They met first in shadow, in a garden carved behind the palace wall. He wandered there alone, heavy with the weight of gods and gold, and she, not knowing he watched, sang softly to the plants as she tended them. He did not speak, not at first, but he returned, night after night, trading his throne for moonlight, and his crown for the way she made him feel like a man before a king. And she, who had never believed in fairy tales, began to. He told her secrets he had never written into scrolls. She showed him a wound on her hand from when she was a child, and trusted too quickly. Together, they became a story neither could write in any public record. He promised her what kings rarely do: honesty. "If I could rewrite the stars," he told her once, "I would place your name among them, where no decree could erase it." But Egypt is an empire of tradition. The pharaoh must marry for alliance, for power, for gods who do not speak, but who are feared nonetheless. And so, he could not choose her, not in the way the world would see, not in the light of day. But love, Real love does not require witness. So he built for her a hidden chamber, deep beneath the palace, a place with no thrones, no altars, no names, only stars, painted across the ceiling. Her stars. And he came to her there, when the court was quiet, when his advisors had retired, when his body ached, not from battle, but from pretending. He promised her that when he died, he would not be buried in gold, not in a tomb with crowds and trumpets, but near her village, quietly, beneath the same tree, where she had once healed a wounded falcon, as a girl, and though she wept, she understood. Their love would not be sung in temples. It would be remembered in the wind, in the hush between waves on the Nile, in the stars, no one names, but always see. Years later, after his death, a single stone was placed, in a field of reeds. No markings, no gold, just a single carving, barely visible. I saw her, and I was never the same. Tonight, as your eyelids grow heavy, as your breath sinks beneath the surface of sleep, remember this: not all love needs a crown. Not all stories need to be known, to be real. Sometimes, a whispered promise beneath the stars outlasts the loudest empire, and sometimes, being seen, truly seen, is the only immortality we ever need. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. A whispered goodbye in Victorian England. There is a particular stillness that only fog can bring, not silence, but a quiet full of weight, where even the gas lamps seem to flicker, more slowly, as if mourning something already gone. In Victorian England, love rarely spoke its name. It lived in glances, in gloved hands brushing against one another, in letters never posted, and farewells that sounded too much like beginnings. This story is a memory, kept between lace and shadow, between a governess and a gentleman. Her name was Eliza. He called her Miss Hartley, though in the safety of his study, he sometimes dared to let her name escape his lips, like a prayer. She was hired to educate his niece, an orphaned child with ink-stained fingers, and a laugh that came out sideways. Eliza taught her Latin, piano, and how to listen to the wind when it had something to say. He was Mr. Thorne, a widower, not unkind, but wrapped in grief, like a wool coat. He refused to take off, even in summer. At first, their connection was professional. Of course it was. This was England, and feelings were to be folded, like napkins. But one night, the girl fell ill, a fever that stole her sleep. Eliza stayed at her bedside, and so did he. They passed the hours reading poetry aloud, each taking turns, voices low, hands steady. At some point, he fell asleep in the armchair, and when he woke, her head was resting on his shoulder. She moved away quickly. He apologized softly, and neither of them ever said a word about it again. But from that night onward, the air between them shifted, a little warmer, a little more dangerous. He began walking her to the garden after lessons. She brought him rare books from second-hand stalls, and once, on a stormy afternoon, they spoke not of the weather, but of the lives they wished they'd had. "Do you ever think," he asked, "that you were born into the wrong story?" She didn't answer, but she looked at him, like a lighthouse looks at the sea, knowing it cannot follow, but still hoping to guide it home. The day she left was not dramatic. No kisses in the rain, no broken promises, only a quiet request from his older sister, who had begun to suspect what had never been said aloud. Eliza was dismissed, with grace, with compensation, with the polite cruelty Victorian England perfected. He watched her carriage disappear into the fog, with one hand at his collar, and the other curled tightly into a fist. She left behind a single note, folded into the final page of a book he'd once lent her. In another life, It read, "We might have walked without gloves, without fear. I would have kissed you in daylight, and you would have smiled, without apology." He never remarried. She never returned, but every spring, the girl now grown would receive a letter from Eliza, filled with poems and pressed violets, and each year, Mr. Thorne would find a book placed on his desk, always marked on the final page. They say he read those final lines more carefully than any headline, any sermon, any decree, because sometimes a whispered goodbye is the only kind of love this world knows how to keep. Now, as the fog rolls gently across your thoughts, as your breath begins to match the rhythm of sleep's slow footsteps, remember, love does not always need to be held, to be real. Some goodbyes are not endings. They are soft beginnings. In lives we never get to live, and even if you never say the words, if you feel them, that's enough. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Love in the shadow of the Great Wall of China. They say the Great Wall was built to keep things out. Barbarians, invaders, wind. But walls, no matter how tall, can never keep love from seeping through the cracks. There, in the hush between bricks, between duty and desire, a different kind of love bloomed. Quiet. Hidden, but no less powerful than the mountains that tried to keep it still. Let us go back to the Ming Dynasty. The empire is vast, the court ornate and precise, and near one long snaking curve of the wall, there lived a young soldier named Liang. He stood watch at the northern pass, where the winds howled and the stars came down close enough to touch. Liang had been conscripted at 16. He was trained to march, to endure, to become stone like the battlements he walked. But even stone, given enough time, learns how to listen to the rain. And one spring, the rain came in the form of May. She was not royalty, not a noble woman, just a tea merchant's daughter, with laughter like river bells, and eyes that dared to linger a moment too long. She came once a week, to bring warm broth and letters from home to the soldiers stationed there. Most ignored her. Liang did not. At first, it was only polite conversation. He asked her about the tea harvest. She asked him if he missed his mother. But soon, he began to wait for her visits, like the desert waits for rain. One day, she brought him a small woven pouch, filled with jasmine flowers. "For sleep," she said, "so you can dream of gentler things." That night, Liang didn't dream of battle or fire. He dreamt of a quiet courtyard, a bamboo garden, a home. Their meetings remained brief. A glance, a gift, a sentence that hinted at 1,000 unsaid things. They never touched. They never needed to. Because some loves are built not from heat, but from the slow accumulation of quiet, sacred trust. But even in the mountains, whispers travel fast. One captain saw too much. Or perhaps he simply saw what he himself had lost long ago. And so May was banned from entering the outpost. Liang was reassigned to a farther, colder section of the wall. No goodbye, just orders, just silence. He obeyed, because that is what soldiers do. But as he rode away, he felt something shift. Inside the armor he had worn for years. Not anger, not sorrow. Something softer, like a promise whispered into a wind that never forgets. Years passed. The wall stood. Empires rose and trembled, and the earth turned patiently beneath it all. Liang survived the wars. He returned home older, quieter, and in a quiet village, beside a tea field grown wild, he saw her, May, still pouring tea, still wearing the same jasmine scent. She looked up. He said nothing. She smiled. "I saved you some dreams," she said, and handed him another small pouch. No declarations, no confessions, just two lives, finally allowed to walk beside each other, because some loves wait, not with desperation, but with dignity. They do not demand, they endure. In the shadow of walls, meant to divide, they grow anyway, like jasmine, through stone. And now, as your breath slows, and your thoughts drift soft, into sleep's open palms, perhaps you too are carrying a memory like this, something that bloomed in silence, something that survived the coldest winters without needing to speak aloud. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The Queen's Hidden Affair. In the Scottish Highlands, they say every queen wears two crowns. One the world sees forged of duty, gold, and law, and the other softer, secret, woven from the threads of longing she dares not speak aloud. This is the story of that second crown, and of the man who made it shimmer. In the wind-swept highlands of Scotland, where the hills hum with old songs, and mist clings like memory to the earth, a queen once escaped her kingdom's gaze. She had ruled from stone palaces. She had walked through echoing halls, lined with polished mirrors and colder hearts. She had smiled 1,000 perfect smiles, but none of them ever reached her bones. So, one summer, when the whispers grew too loud, and her soul grew too quiet, she left. The royal carriage rolled through thistle and moor, toward a hunting lodge hidden near Loch Shiel, where no courtiers followed, and no portraits stared back. There, among deer paths and quiet lochs, she let the wind unpin her hair. She let the silence undo her posture. She let herself breathe. And it was there in that breath that he appeared. He wasn't a prince or a nobleman, just a botanist, a man who read the language of ferns and whispered to seeds as he planted them. His name was Callum. He didn't recognize her at first. She was only a figure beneath a wool cloak, tracing the outline of a leaf with a gloved finger. She asked him about the heather. He answered with the gentleness of someone who's more in love with life than with power. Their conversations were scattered at first, like petals on a path. One day it was wildflowers. Another, the migration of birds. One morning, the color of silence at sunrise. The Queen had never known silence could have color. He never bowed. He never flinched when she spoke. She told him her name was Ellen, not Queen Ellen, just Ellen. And in those highlands, she began to remember what it meant to be a woman before being a ruler. One evening, beneath a sky dusted with the beginnings of stars, he handed her a pressed bloom from a flower she hadn't noticed. Most people only see the obvious, he said, but the rarest beauty is always the one growing quietly. She didn't reply, but her fingers lingered on his. There was no grand affair, no scandalous embrace, only moments. Moments where she let her laughter return, moments where she watched his hands with the same reverence, others reserved for relics, moments when she forgot the weight of her title. But kingdoms, even in their silence, always find a way to call their queen back. A letter arrived, sealed in red wax, smelling faintly of duty. She didn't open it at first. That night, as they walked beside the loch, she told him the truth. He said nothing, only took her hand. Then let's make this night a century, he said. And for a few hours, they did. When she left the next morning, there were no goodbyes, only a flower, tucked into the fold of her cloak. Years passed. She ruled well, wisely, kindly. Her people called her fair. Her enemies called her formidable. And every spring, when the first heather bloomed, she walked alone through the palace gardens, pausing beside a small, hidden corner where a highland bloom grew wild and free. Sometimes, she simply stood, and though she never saw Callum again, she often dreamt of hands that never sought to own, only to understand. Because some loves do not ask for forever. They ask only to be real, for as long as they are alive. Even queens, especially queens, deserve to wear both crowns, even if one lives only in memory. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The Emperor's Favorite. They called her Mei Lian, Plum Blossom, because she bloomed in the cold. She was not born of silk or jade. Her hands once knew the weight of baskets, not bracelets. Her feet once moved freely through river mud, not palace stone, but fate. That strange and winding river has its own compass, and hers carried her to the forbidden city. It began with a song. She was singing it beneath the cherry trees, at the temple of the moon goddess, a song her grandmother taught her. Low, haunting, ancient. The emperor was passing in secret. He had tired of sycophants and ceremonies, of gold. He had sought the temple not as ruler, but as a man seeking quiet. And in that quiet, he heard her voice. He didn't know her name. He didn't see her face. He only knew that in that song, someone remembered sorrow beautifully. Days passed. Weeks. He sent messengers, disguised as poets, monks, traders, asking, always, for the girl with the voice that carried longing like silk. Eventually, she was found. When Mei Lian was brought to the palace, she did not weep. She did not bow as deeply as the others expected. She looked up at the emperor, with eyes like twilight, and he smiled not as emperor, but as a man who had once been forgotten by his own joy. He asked her to sing again. She sang the same song, but softer this time, as if to remind him that beauty is a thing you hold gently. From that moment on, she was no longer a peasant. She was his favorite, not in the way of court games, where favorites are named for show, but in truth, in silence, in stolen moments beneath red lanterns, and walks by the koi pond, when the moon was their only witness. The court whispered, "How could a girl without noble blood wear robes lined with dragon thread? How could she sit beside the Son of Heaven and laugh with him as if he were mortal?" But the emperor, for once, did not care. He began to change. He smiled more. He paused to listen. He asked questions about how the harvest fared in distant provinces, about the weight of taxes on those who had little. And the advisors saw, with fear or wonder, that love had made him more just. But empires do not take kindly to the unpredictable. Whispers grew louder. Ministers plotted. Allies turned cold. A noblewoman, elegant, powerful, with lineage as sharp as her ambition, presented an ultimatum: choose her or risk unrest. And for the first time, the emperor faltered. He summoned Mei Lian to the chamber of falling petals. She knew. She did not ask him to choose. She did not plead. She only placed a plum blossom on the table between them. "Some flowers," she said, "bloom only once, and in that moment, they are eternal." He wept, not as a ruler, as a man. She left the palace that night, beneath a moon that looked as hollow as his heart. But she was not sent away in disgrace. She was given a garden in the south, a quiet house with many windows, and freedom. And every spring, when the plum trees bloomed, a royal courier arrived, with a single white scroll. No words, only a painted blossom. And in the palace, the emperor kept a robe she had once worn, folded beneath his pillow, because not all love is meant to be loud. Some love, the real kind, is meant to be remembered. In silence, in season, in soul. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. A time traveler's lost love in ancient Greece. Time does not flow as you think. It is not a river, but a labyrinth, with doors that open in dreams, in forgotten corners, in broken clocks. He was a traveler, not of maps, but of moments. His name had been lost long ago, to the folds of the future. All he carried with him was a silver compass that did not point north, but to yearning. He arrived in Athens, when the marble still gleamed white, when the air was thick with olive trees and philosophy, not as a conqueror, but as a ghost in borrowed sandals, walking among statues that were not yet ruins. He kept to the edges of the agora, where words flew like birds between minds. He studied the sun's angle, the slope of the columns, the rhythm of time unspoiled. And then he saw her. She moved like a whispered verse, hair bound in the style of temple girls, eyes dark as fig wine. She was neither a noblewoman nor a servant, but something in between, a scribe for a philosopher, translating thoughts into symbols, on scrolls that would one day crumble. He watched her, day after day, as she dipped her reed into ink, pausing not to catch breath, but to savor meaning. One afternoon, she dropped a scroll, and he picked it up before the wind could take it. Their fingers touched, and for a moment, he was not out of place. Her name was Callianera. Her laugh was like water over stone. She believed in reason, but she made room for mystery. He told her stories, not of where he was from, but of the stars, and how the moon pulls oceans, without touching them. She told him of dreams she'd had, about falling up, not down, of meeting strangers who already knew her, who cried when they saw her face. He wanted to tell her the truth, that he did know her, not from the past, but from a painting in a museum, where her name had been forgotten, but her eyes had never changed. But how do you explain to someone that you are here only temporarily, that you belong to no year, no century, no map? He stayed longer than he should have. The compass grew restless, time frayed at the edges. He began to feel pulled, not by choice, but by design. On their last day together, they watched the sun disappear. Behind the Acropolis, she leaned into him and whispered, "You don't belong to this world, do you?" He said nothing, but he placed the compass in her hands, closing her fingers around it. "Then I'll wait," she said, and she did. For weeks, she returned to the hill, where they had Saturday. She carried the compass in her robes, even as time did what it always does, moved on. Years passed. Her hair grayed. Scrolls turned brittle, but every night, she whispered to the stars, "I knew someone once, who arrived with silence and left me with wonder." Centuries later, in a dim museum, a traveler stood before a glass case. Inside was an ancient compass. Its needle spun wildly when he entered the room, and beside it, a faded sketch of a woman, with eyes like fig wine, and a scroll in her lap. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he smelled olive trees, heard distant laughter, felt a hand in his. Some love stories do not end. They echo, they ripple, they wait. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The librarian who fell in love with a ghost. In the heart of a forgotten city, where ivy crept across brick and silence held hands with memory, there stood an old library. It had no name on its door, no neon signs, no hours of operation, but somehow, those who truly needed it always found their way. The librarian was a gentle soul. She wore sweaters that held the scent of lavender and ink, and glasses too large for her face. Her name was Eleanor. She spoke rarely, but her hands knew every spine on the shelves. She dusted first editions as if they were sacred relics, whispered apologies to creased pages, and believed deeply that books had souls. But there was one room she never entered. The Forgotten Wing, they called it, tucked behind an arched oak door with no handle, just a faded engraving, to be read only by the heart. The key had been lost decades ago, or perhaps it had chosen to remain hidden. Then, one stormy evening, when the world was all thunder and flickering candlelight, Eleanor heard it. A violin. Soft, trembling, sorrowful. It was not from the radio. Not from the streets. It came from the forgotten wing. She froze. The air held its breath. The sound was impossibly old. Not just music, but memory. In sound form, she followed it. And when she placed her hand on the smooth wood of the sealed door, the lock gave way, with a sigh, like someone exhaling after years of waiting. Inside, moonlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting stories in color across the floor. Books lined the walls, but their titles shimmered and changed when you weren't looking directly at them. At the far end, beneath a grand vaulted ceiling, sat a man at a piano that played no sound, and yet the music lingered. He was dressed in a velvet coat, as if pulled from the 19th century. Hair tousled, eyes distant, like someone who had known too many goodbyes. Eleanor didn't speak. She simply stepped closer, drawn by something deeper than curiosity, deeper even than longing. The man looked up, and in that glance, she felt something familiar, like a page she'd dog-eared in another life. "You hear me?" he said, voice barely more than air. She nodded. "No one's heard me in a very long time." He told her his name was Adrian, a poet, once, a composer. He had lived in this city when it was alive with lanterns and horse carriages. He had played in this very room when it hosted salons filled with laughter and cigars and sorrow. But his love, a woman named Lila, had died young, and he, unable to leave the melody of her behind, lingered too long in this place, until time forgot him. Only the books remembered. Only the pages held his scent. Eleanor visited him every night, at first to listen, then to speak, then simply to be near. They read to one another. She brought him tea he couldn't taste, and he gifted her words she'd never find elsewhere. "Why me?" she once whispered. "Because you read like you're listening to someone's soul." He played for her, not with his hands, but with his memory, and the music wrapped around her like a lullaby lost in a snowstorm. Days passed, weeks, or perhaps it was centuries disguised as minutes. And then one evening, he stopped appearing. The room was silent, still, cold. Eleanor waited. She lit candles. She whispered stories. But the ghost did not return. Instead, she found a single note, tucked inside a worn copy of Leaves of Grass. It read, "You taught me how to be heard again. That is love. And I am free now, because of it." She cried, but they were not tears of grief. They were the kind of tears you shed when a long-held book finally closes, with the ending you never expected, but always needed. Eleanor returned to her desk. She kept the library warm, alive, full of soft footsteps and whispered awe. And every so often, when the rain pressed gently on the windows, she'd hear a violin, playing in a room that never stayed locked for long. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The love letter that crossed a century. In a quiet attic of a crumbling Victorian house, where dust floated like ancient snow, a box lay hidden beneath a crooked floorboard. Not hidden out of secrecy, but out of hope that one day, someone would find it. Inside the box were yellowed papers, faded ribbons, and at the very top, a letter. Its envelope bore the year 1912. The ink was brittle, cracked at the loops of cursive. But the words, the words still breathed. "To the one I'll never stop loving, even if time forgets us." The woman who found it was named Clara, a historian, a dreamer, someone who preferred the scent of old pages to the noise of screens. She had been cataloging antiques, but in truth, she was searching for something she couldn't quite name. And now, in her hands, she held a voice from another century. The letter was addressed to "My beloved Isaac," written by a woman named Eleanor. Not the same Eleanor of the library, but perhaps kin in spirit. It was not a farewell letter, nor a confession. It was something rarer, a promise stretched across time. I'll write you, even if you never read it. I'll love you, even if your name fades from the census. Love like this doesn't care if it's seen. Clara read every line aloud, her voice shaking like candlelight. In the letter, Eleanor described a war brewing in Europe, an engagement broken not by betrayal, but by duty. Isaac had left for the front, believing he'd return. Eleanor waited. Every Sunday, she walked to the train station, wearing the green scarf he once admired. But he never returned. Yet still, she wrote. Every week. For years, she tucked the letters into the cracks of her walls, under floorboards, behind books. She wasn't sending them out. She was planting them like seeds. Maybe someday someone will find these and know that we existed. That love once filled this house like music. Clara searched the rest of the attic with reverence. Over the next few days, she uncovered 11 more letters, each one revealing more. Of their first meeting under a copper lamppost, of picnics beneath sycamores, of a song Isaac wrote just for her. In one letter Eleanor had written, "They say time is a river, but I think it's a sea. We are boats who once passed each other in moonlight. And maybe, just maybe, someone will sail again through our tides." Clara began to dream of them. Eleanor and Isaac not as ghosts, but as living memories stitched into the house's bones. She couldn't let the story die again, so she wrote back. She penned a reply to Eleanor, not because she expected an answer, but because she believed in echoes. "I found your love, Eleanor, and I believe in it. It made it here. Across 100 years, across wars and silence and dust, your love arrived." She placed the letter in the same box, added fresh lavender, and sealed it gently. But something strange happened. As she closed the lid, the room grew warmer. A breeze impossible from inside ruffled her hair, and on the attic wall, bare for decades, appeared a faint outline. 2 names etched by fingertip. Eleanor plus Isaac. Clara smiled. She didn't question the magic. She simply accepted it, as one might accept the hush of snowfall, or the way the sun pauses before setting. She left the box in the attic, knowing someone else would find it again someday, maybe in another century, maybe in another kind of world. And so, the love letter crossed time not by mail, but by memory, by wonder, by the willingness of a stranger to believe that love never disappears. It only waits to be found again. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. 2 stars that fell in love in the sky. Long before humans gave the stars names, before charts and telescopes and navigation maps, the sky was a storybook, and every point of light was a whisper, a secret folded into black velvet. Some stars flickered with loneliness, some burned with purpose, but 2 of them, just 2, learned to love. They were born far apart, twin embers in opposite quadrants of the sky. One pulsed in the belly of Orion's belt, a proud blue fire with a restless gleam. The other shimmered quietly near the curve of Cassiopeia, softer, golden, like the last candle in a quiet temple. They did not speak in words. Stars do not need language. They speak in gravity, in light curves, in pulses that reach across the cosmos. For 1,000 years, they simply noticed each other, and that noticing grew into something like affection, the kind that stirs in silence, slow and aching. When comets passed, they whispered hello. When eclipses darkened the space between them, they waited with patience only ancient things can know. The universe, in its immensity, rarely allows love stories to bloom uninterrupted. But this was different. Over centuries, the 2 stars began to drift, ever so slightly, toward one another. Astronomers on Earth would later name this movement a binary star migration. But that's just the science. The truth was, they were falling, not in the sense of crashing, but in the sacred sense of surrender. Each orbit was a vow, each rotation a devotion, They came to orbit a shared point, dancing an invisible waltz, always near, never touching. But even in such closeness, they remained apart, because if two stars draw too near, they burn each other into oblivion. Love between stars, like love between souls, must learn the art of distance. Still, they glowed brighter together. Their combined light cast ripples of warmth across light years. And down below, on a small blue planet, lovers would lie on hillsides and make wishes on their shimmer. They called them names: Alarian and Seraphine, or Vega and Altair, or simply those two stars that never leave each other. Sometimes, an old poet in a tower would write of them as celestial soulmates, eternally circling but never colliding. And perhaps, somewhere in the deep knowing part of the human heart, we understood that love isn't always about meeting. It's about moving in rhythm. It's about gravity that holds without gripping. One evening, after thousands of years of this shared motion, the golden star began to dim. Stars, like people, carry lifespans. The blue star pulsed in protest, its heat rising, its light sharpening into defiance. But nothing could stop it. The golden star was fading, ready to return its atoms to the cosmos, so others might be born. Her last pulse was soft, a lullaby, a farewell. She did not vanish. She transformed. Nebula, dust, echo, and the blue star, once wild and blazing, became gentler. It slowed, it cooled, but it never left the orbit they'd shared. It circled the empty space, where she had been, like a dancer still waltzing. After the music has ended, he became a variable star, his light flickering in irregular rhythms, as if remembering. Astronomers call it a mystery. Why would a star pulsate this way? But the sky knows, and now you do too. If you ever find yourself beneath a night sky, and you see two stars, one steady, one flickering, know that you're witnessing a love story. Older than pyramids, older than language, older than grief. A story of two stars that fell in love and changed the light forever. Now, let's move on to the next chapter, A Clockmaker's Love in Steampunk Paris. In a version of Paris that never was, and perhaps always is, the sky is a soft shade of copper at dusk, and the rooftops hum with gears, levers, and the steady breath of machines. The Eiffel Tower pulses with electric steam. Airships drift like lazy clouds overhead, their shadows curving across cobbled streets. And deep in the 3rd arrondissement, behind a half-curtained window, a man tends to time itself. He is a clockmaker, not just of hours and minutes, but of lives. He repairs watches that have lost their memories, timepieces that still tick but have forgotten why. His hands are calloused from winding springs, his eyes softened from watching too many sunsets alone. But he remembers her. She came in one rainy afternoon, the scent of lavender and oil in her wake, carrying a music box that no longer sang. Her name was Evienne, and her voice, it sounded like it had once been laughter, softened by sadness. She said the box had belonged to her mother, a gift passed down, now silent. Could he fix it? He took it gently, like something sacred, promised nothing, promised everything. For days he worked on the tiny machine, studying its delicate teeth, its rusted song wheel, the whisper of its lost tune. But more than that, he found himself waiting for the chime above the door, for the sound of her boots against the metal floor. And she returned, always at the same time, just before twilight. Some evenings, she brought tea. Others, silence. But always, she brought presents. They talked of things lost, of time, of war, of people who disappear between one breath and the next. She told him of her father, a train conductor who vanished aboard the Skyline Express. He told her of his brother, a soldier who had written letters until one day he didn't. Their wounds spoke in harmony. The music box remained unopened, as if it too needed time to remember how to sing. Then, one evening, under the golden hush of gaslight, he offered her something small, a watch he'd built from scratch. On the back, etched in fine brass, were the words, "Time moves forward, but some hearts stay behind." She smiled with the sadness of someone who knows exactly what that means. She took the watch. She kissed his cheek, and for a moment, the city's clocks paused. Not stopped, not broken, just paused, as if time itself wanted to linger in that moment. That night, the music box finally worked, not because he'd fixed it, but because she had whispered something to it before leaving. He never asked what. Some songs are not meant to be explained, but the melody, oh, the melody. It was the lullaby of steam whistles in moonlight, of late-night laughter in cafe windows, of two souls who had found each other, not in the peak of youth, but in the soft hours of after. She came for weeks after that, until one day, she didn't. No letter, no goodbye. Only the watch remained on the counter, ticking faithfully. Inside the casing, a new engraving had appeared, perhaps scratched by a different hand, perhaps etched by magic. It read, "I will meet you again, when the gears align." And so he waited. Every morning, he polished the counter. Every evening, he tuned the music box. The world outside shifted. Airships gave way to satellites. Steam gave way to silence. But inside the little shop in Paris, time kept turning, the way love does. Quietly, stubbornly, beautifully. He never saw her again. But sometimes, when dusk paints the sky copper, the door chime rings on its own, and the music box plays a note too many. And in that moment, he smiles, because time, as he once told her, moves forward, but some hearts, the best ones, stay behind, to wait for love. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The painter who waited by the sea. There is a village at the very end of the coastline, so far from cities that even the stars seem louder than traffic, and the sea is not a visitor, but a neighbor, a lullaby, a witness. Here, in a little white house with blue shutters peeling from sea wind, a painter lived alone. His name was Elian, and every day, for 27 years, he set his easel on the cliffs above the ocean and painted the horizon. Not ships, not sunsets, not waves crashing in their theatrical fury, only the horizon. That thin line where sky kisses sea, always out of reach, always the same, and always different. People in the village whispered about him. Some said he'd once been famous, a prodigy in the Paris galleries, until one stormy summer turned his canvas inward. Others said he had fallen in love with a woman from the sea, a siren perhaps, or simply someone whose heart beat to the rhythm of tides. But only Elian knew the truth. He had met her on that very cliff, on a July afternoon when the sky wore gold, and the ocean curled with light. She had been sketching, not landscapes, but people, faces that seemed pulled from dreams. They shared silence for a long time, then laughter, then weeks that felt like wind chimes strung across time. Her name was Maria. Her eyes held storms and lullabies at once. They spoke of art and how sometimes you don't choose what to paint. It chooses you. They spoke of childhood, of mothers who sang to the moon, of colors that only lovers can see. And just as quickly as she arrived, she left. She said only, "I'll return when the sea allows me to." And he believed her. Because sometimes, love comes not as a vow, but as a feeling too heavy for logic. So, Elian waited, and he painted. Every morning, he mixed blues and grays and rose golds, capturing the exact shade of the horizon. From that day she left. Every evening, he would write her a letter. Most began with, "Today, the sky looked a little like you." The villagers would bring him warm bread and news of festivals. But he never left the cliffs. Not really. He sold a few paintings to tourists. They called his work minimalist, not knowing it was devotion distilled into brushstrokes. Then, 27 years since she disappeared, a storm rolled in. The kind that gnashes at shorelines and shudders. The kind that sweeps stories off rooftops. But Elian didn't run. He stood at his easel, brush in hand, as if waiting for the sea to give back what it had taken. The next morning, the storm had gone. The village emerged, blinking and bruised. And on the cliff, Elian was asleep, his canvas soaked, his hands stained blue. But on the horizon, a ship floated. Not a grand vessel, not a fishing boat, just a small skiff with a single figure, sketchbook in hand, eyes full of storm and sunlight. Maria, the sea had returned her. They said she'd aged not a day. They said she smelled of salt and wind, and time paused. She stayed, not forever, but long enough for laughter to return to the cliffs. Elian painted her only once, her face blurred at the edges, as if he knew she belonged more to legend than canvas. Then, one morning, the house was empty again. No letters, no goodbyes. Only the final painting left behind, signed by 2 names. Elian never painted again, but every dawn, he would climb the cliff, sit on the rock where they once shared oranges and secrets, and hum her favorite song, a tune only the sea could answer. Years later, when the house fell into disrepair, the village tried to preserve his work, but the paintings had faded, or maybe they had never been meant to last. Still, people say, when the mist hangs low and the ocean quiets its breathing, you can see a man and a woman standing on the cliff, hands brushing, watching the horizon, waiting, because love, like art, doesn't always need to be finished. It only needs to be true. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. A love spell whispered by the forest witch. Deep within the forest, past the paths known to hunters, beyond where even the birds forget to sing, there lived a woman with hair the color of river clay, and eyes that glowed like wet leaves in moonlight. The villagers never dared say her name aloud. They called her only the forest witch, though she was no more cruel than an old tree, no more strange than a dream you can't quite remember. Some feared her. Others whispered stories of her kindness in secret. But all agreed on one thing. She could weave spells with the softness of sighs. Her cottage was half swallowed by ivy, with walls made of old books and bone-white birch, a chimney that sighed like an old man asleep, and windows that blinked with candlelight at dusk. And though people rarely dared to knock on her door, once in a rare while, someone would wander too far into the trees, carrying a broken heart, or a wish too tender to speak aloud. It was on one such evening when the fog lay low and silver, that a traveler came. He was a mapmaker, young and lost in more ways than one. His name was Wren. He'd wandered into the forest, chasing the idea of a road that no map dared to draw, but mostly, he was running from the echo of a voice he could no longer remember without ache. A love, not bitter but unfinished, like a song interrupted by rain. He found the witch not by accident, but because she had been waiting. She invited him in without asking his name. He sat in her warm, strange cottage, where teacups moved on their own and herbs hung like sleepy children from the rafters. He asked only one question. "Can you help me forget her?" The witch looked at him, long and quiet. Then, instead of answering, she stirred a pot of nettle and lavender and said gently, "Forgetting is a violence. Would you trade pain for hollowness?" Wren lowered his eyes. "Then make me remember her sweetly, without drowning." The witch smiled. "That I can do. But you must offer me something true." He searched his pockets, gold coins, broken compass, a button from his childhood coat. She shook her head. "Not from your pockets, from your heart." So, he gave her the story of how they met near a bridge where paper lanterns floated like fireflies. of how she loved the smell of old books and the way autumn spoke through trees, of how her laugh sounded like sunlight warming cold stones, and of how he had let her go, not because he stopped loving her, but because she wanted a life he didn't yet understand. The witch listened, stirring. Every word salted the brew, thickened it into memory. Finally, she whispered a spell so softly it barely stirred the air. May love no longer ache like glass beneath the skin. May the memory rest, like leaves upon still water. And may the heart remember without hunger. She handed him a tiny vial of liquid that shimmered like tears. Drink this under a full moon, alone. Then walk until you find the sound of her name without sorrow. Wren thanked her. He left the forest that night, the vial warm against his chest, and for the first time in many years, he slept without dreaming of falling. Weeks passed, and when the next full moon bloomed in the sky like a pearl, he followed her instructions. He drank the spell and walked, through fields still wet with dew, over hills that hummed with crickets, through a town where someone smiled like she once did, and it no longer shattered him. Eventually, he stopped walking, because he no longer needed to chase her shadow, but he kept the map, and on its final page, where no road was marked, he drew the forest witch's cottage, not so others could find her, but so he would always remember that some magic is not in the forgetting, but in remembering gently. Back in the forest, the witch poured herself tea and smiled into the leaves, because her spells were never about erasing love, only about softening its echo so it could sing again without breaking. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The musician who played for the moon. There once lived a man in a crumbling city of stone and shadows, where the nights stretched long and the stars hung low like lanterns. He was known only as the musician. No one remembered where he came from, only that he arrived one winter evening, carrying a violin wrapped in velvet and silence. He never spoke, but every night, when the world had turned quiet, after the market stalls were shuttered and the children's dreams had begun, he climbed to the rooftop of an old apartment building and began to play. His melodies were not meant for men. They were not composed for applause or coin. They were lullabies spun from longing, sonatas sculpted from memory, songs that knew how to ache and heal in the same breath. The people below learned to live by his rhythms. The baker rose with the first gentle chord. The insomniac slept only when he heard the second movement, and lovers paused their arguments to listen, letting the music say what words could not. But the musician, he played for only one audience, the moon. Each night, she rose over the city's crooked skyline, watching from her high, silver throne, and each night he played as if her light were the only thing that mattered. You might think it lonely, to offer so much to something so distant, so silent, but he never looked sad. In fact, when he played, his eyes would close and his face would soften, like a man remembering the way love once felt. The truth, whispered through the wind, was that he had once fallen in love, deeply, quietly, with a woman who believed the moon was her mother. She would dance in the moonlight barefoot, trace the stars with her fingers, and tell him that every night sky held a secret just for them. She said her heart beat in the rhythm of moonrise, that her soul pulled with the tides, that someday the moon would call her home. He laughed gently, kissed her brow, never imagining that one day she would vanish. No note, no sound, only a window left open, curtains fluttering like wings. She was gone. Some said she ran away. Others believed she had fallen into grief and wandered beyond the city. But the musician? He believed she had gone to the moon, so he began to play for her. Not to call her back, but to tell her he remembered. Each note was a letter. Each song, a memory strung like pearls on a thread of longing. He played through seasons, through frost and rain, through summer winds and autumn fog. And always the moon listened, quiet and still, glowing just a little softer, as if moved by the music below. Then one night, many years later, He climbed the rooftop, bow in hand, and stood beneath a full, aching moon. But this time, he didn't play. He simply looked up and smiled. Because, in the moon's glow, for the briefest moment, he saw her, not as a ghost, not as a memory, but standing, barefoot, bathed in silver, her eyes full of stars. She didn't speak, neither did he. But in the silence between them, every note he'd ever played found its place, and the moon, kind and full, held them both in her light. He closed his eyes, and when the city woke the next morning, the rooftop was empty, but the violin remained, still humming with a final, quiet chord. Now, sometimes, if you listen closely, you might hear music drifting from the sky itself, a melody not meant for men, but for the moon and the love she kept. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The girl who dreamt of the Viking prince. In a quiet village where winters were long and stories lived longer, there was a girl named Elva. She was born beneath the dancing lights of the Aurora Borealis, and her mother used to say that the stars had whispered her name. Elva was no ordinary child. While other children played by the fire and dreamed of warm hearths, Elva stood barefoot in the snow, gazing at the sea. She listened to the wind as though it spoke in a language only she could understand. And sometimes, she would hum a song no one had taught her. The villagers, kind and simple, called her dreamy. They said she had too much imagination, too much sky in her eyes. But they didn't know that every night, when sleep claimed her, she sailed away. Her dreams were vivid, clear as crystal, and always the same. A great longship slicing through frozen waves. A prince at its helm, tall, fierce, wrapped in fur and moonlight. His eyes were stormy seas. His voice was thunder made tender. In her dreams, he came not to conquer, but to call her name. Elva, he would say, as though he had waited lifetimes to speak it. They would walk together across icy cliffs, speak of stars and swords, and of love forged not from comfort, but from courage. When she awoke, her pillow damp with tears, she would feel the imprint of his hand in hers. At first, she told no one. It seemed too beautiful to share, too impossible. But night after night, the dream returned. She learned his laugh. She memorized the texture of his armor. She even knew the shape of the scar that ran beneath his eye. A mark, he once said, came from saving a fox, not winning a war. It was more than fantasy. It became her second life, one that felt as real, as needed, as the breath in her chest. As years passed, the dream never faded. But the village began to look at her differently. She never married, never stayed too long in one place. They said she was waiting for someone who didn't exist. Elva only smiled, because she knew something they didn't. One winter's night, under a sky heavy with snow, she climbed the cliffs where sea met sky. She whispered his name, just once, and the wind answered, not with words, but with the distant sound of oars cutting through waves, banks of sails billowing with the breath of ancient gods. She closed her eyes, and in the soft dark behind her lids, he was there again, the Viking prince, her dream's constant shore. But this time, he reached for her, and she felt it, not just in sleep, not just in longing, but in the marrow of her being. That night, she vanished. Some say she wandered into the forest and never returned. Others believe she fell into the sea. But on cold nights, when the auroras dance across the sky like silk, if you listen closely, you can hear her laughter carried on the wind. And if you dream deeply enough, you might just see a longship at the edge of your mind, and a prince reaching out his hand. Because love, when born of soul and snow and starlight, has no borders, only tides. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The gentle knight who loved a healer. In a kingdom long forgotten by history books but remembered by hearts, there was a knight who did not shout. He did not roar upon his steed or boast of battle scars. His sword was sharp, yes, but his eyes were softer than spring rain. They called him Sir Alden. But behind closed doors and blooming hedgerows, they simply called him the Gentle One. Alden lived on the edge of the kingdom, not in a castle, but in a modest cottage with ivy climbing its stones. His horse, Tamsin, grazed nearby, and birds often perched on his shoulder as though he were one of them. He preferred the forest's quiet over courtly noise. He'd once said that the only war worth fighting was the one within, and that peace was the most courageous thing a man could choose. But every peaceful life has a ripple, and for Alden, that ripple had a name, Mira. She was the healer in the village below, with hands that smelled of lavender and earth, and eyes that looked into wounds and saw both pain and story. She was not royalty. She owned no land. But when she entered a room, the candles flickered a little taller. Alden had met her after returning from a distant skirmish. Not for glory, only duty. He came back with a broken rib, a shallow gash, and a mind that flinched at shadows. Mira had stitched the wound, and then she'd said nothing. She didn't ask for tales. She didn't praise or pity. Instead, she gave him tea, Saturday beside him in silence, and handed him a sprig of thyme, saying only, "For memory," to heal gently. He returned the next day with wildflowers. The day after, with a carved wooden bird. They never called it courtship. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping sonnets beneath moonlight, only the quiet rituals of knowing. She would hum while she crushed herbs. He would light her candles when storms rolled in. She never asked him about battles. He never asked her why her eyes sometimes welled up when the wind whispered certain songs. Their love was made not in fire, but in the soft warmth that follows rain. Over the years, Alden never stopped being a knight, but he chose his quests carefully. No longer for kings, but for causes. He once rode 3 days to deliver medicine to a sick child in a distant glen. Another time, he built a bridge where there was none, so that no one would need to risk the river again. Always, he returned to Mira. They never married in the formal sense, but each morning, they greeted the day hand in hand. And each night, he'd whisper a blessing against her hairline. "For all you've healed that I never knew was broken." When time began to fold softly into age, they slowed. She began to forget certain names, certain dates, but never his face, never the sound of his voice calling her beloved. And when she finally slipped into the deepest sleep, Alden planted a garden where her apothecary once stood. He tended it with the care of a soldier guarding sacred ground. Lavender, thyme, chamomile, and a single oak tree under which he would sit, eyes closed, remembering not the battles, but the stillness she had gifted him. In a world obsessed with power and pageantry, he had found the rarest of honors: to love and be loved by someone who healed not just wounds, but the soul behind them. So if ever you find yourself walking through an ancient glade, and you see a knight tending to flowers instead of fighting dragons, offer him your quiet. He'll offer you a story, one about a healer, and a love strong enough to mend a heart wearing armor. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Falling in love in an old bookshop. It sat on a crooked little street, tucked between a tailor's shop and a closed-down bakery. The kind of shop you could almost walk past without noticing, its windows fogged in winter, cracked slightly in summer, and behind the glass were towers of books stacked like old friends whispering secrets. The wooden sign above creaked when the wind kissed it. It read, "Winter and Company Books, Est, 1872. But no one really remembered the "and Company" anymore. Just winter. Just the books. It smelled of time itself. Dust, cedar shelves, ink ghosts, and candle wax. There was a bell on the door, but it only rang for those who needed it most. He came in one autumn afternoon, the kind where the light is gold but fading. His coat was too big for him, his hair a little damp from the drizzle, and his eyes looked like they'd once held entire chapters. but the pages had been lost. She sat at the counter, nose buried in a book of forgotten poetry. Her name was Elowen, a name that sounded like wind in trees and lullabies in forgotten tongues. She didn't look up at first, not until he sneezed, violently, dramatically, knocking over a stack of Victorian romances. Books tumbled like dominoes, and he apologized so many times that she laughed, a sound like soft chimes through dust motes. That was how it began. He was a historian. She was a dreamer. He liked footnotes and archives. She liked stories that bent the rules of time. Each week, he returned. Sometimes for a book, sometimes just to ask her things like, "Do you believe objects remember?" Or, "Can a person live more than one lifetime through literature?" She always answered with something strange and warm. "Yes," she once said, handing him a book with a feather between its pages. Some books keep pieces of their readers tucked inside. They hum if you listen. They never called it love. They called it shared reverence, kindred curiosity, and, eventually, our time. She'd brew him tea, chamomile or mint. He'd read aloud from letters written in ink so faded you had to squint. Once, he brought her a book about stars, and she traced the constellations on his palm with a finger. Neither of them noticed how slowly the days melted into each other, how their silences grew softer, warmer, less like absences and more like belonging. One day, the roof leaked. A storm rolled in. Thunder cracked like 1,000 pages being torn at once. They hurried to cover the stacks. In the chaos, their hands touched briefly, tenderly, and that was all. No fireworks, no grand kiss, just warmth, a knowing. When winter came, the bookshop became a world unto itself. He brought her gloves, threadbare but loved. She wrote him a story on tiny slips of paper, leaving one hidden inside a book each week. "I found chapter 4 today," he'd whisper, and she'd blush, as if stories could bloom into something as real as hearts beating side by side. Eventually, someone asked him, "What's the best book you've ever read?" He smiled. "I haven't finished it yet," he said. She works behind the counter and smells like parchment and possibility. They never married, but they built a home out of laughter between shelves. She stayed, he stayed, and the bookshop, that tender cradle of stories, held them gently, like an old book that knows its pages will be read again and again, each time more deeply than the last. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. A love story told over tea in 1942, London. The war had painted everything gray. Even the sky seemed tired of being looked at with longing. Streets wore scars from falling bombs, and every shop window had tape across it like a wound hastily bandaged. But there, nestled between a tobacconist and a newsagent, was the Green Hearth tea room. It always smelled of bergamot and coal smoke, and when the air raid sirens weren't wailing, you could hear the soft clatter of teaspoons stirring sugar into chipped teacups. She worked the counter, her hands steady despite the tremble in the world. Her name was Alice, hair the color of a foggy morning, eyes like bruised violets. She carried the grace of someone who had forgotten how to panic. He first came in on a Thursday, the kind of afternoon where rain curled against the windows like a cat. He wore an RAF uniform, his hat tucked beneath one arm. There was mud on his boots and poetry on his face. He asked for Darjeeling. She gave him Earl Grey. Neither of them minded. They sat in silence for 7 minutes. Just enough time for two strangers to become curious. When he spoke, it was with a voice that didn't match the war. Soft, uncertain. "Do you think the world will remember this?" he asked, gesturing to the air outside where silence had become louder than gunfire. She tilted her head. "Maybe not the world," she said, "but I will. I remember everything worth saving." The next week, he came again, this time with flowers tucked in the folds of a ration card. He handed them to her without a word. She placed them in a milk bottle beside the register. They didn't call it love. No one did back then. It was too fragile a word to place beside headlines and telegrams. Instead, they shared sugar cubes and glances. Stories wrapped in steam and scones. She told him about her father, who once made violins in Prague. He told her about a place in Yorkshire where the stars felt close enough to touch. Sometimes, the power went out, and the tea room turned to shadow. She'd light a single candle, and in that flickering world, their eyes found each other like magnets that had been waiting a lifetime to meet. One morning, he didn't come. The flowers wilted. The kettle whistled alone. Days passed, then weeks. War was like that. It swallowed people without warning. Then, one afternoon, the bell above the door rang, and there he was. His arm was in a sling. His face carried new lines, etched by pain and fire. But his eyes still looked for her, and when they found her, something in the room exhaled. She poured him tea. No words at first, just the rhythm of healing. Eventually, he spoke. "I didn't know if I'd come back." She placed her hand over his, warm, still, steady. "Neither did I," she whispered. "But I left the candle burning." They never married, never wore rings. But each Sunday, they met at the green hearth, ordered 2 teas, and shared silence like it was sacred. Years later, long after the sirens and sandbags were gone, someone reopened the tea room. Inside a drawer by the register, they found a pressed violet and a ration card with Darjeeling scribbled in fading pencil. They framed it, and every evening, just before close, they lit a candle on the table by the window. Some stories never needed telling. They simply steeped in time, infusing everything they touched with quiet, enduring love. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. A gentle romance at the winter ball. It began with a snowfall. Soft, quiet, like the hush before a confession. The kind of snow that doesn't demand attention, only asks you to notice it. In the ballroom of a countryside manor, the air shimmered with the hush of anticipation. Candlelight danced on polished floors, and violins hummed with the careful grace of something too elegant for war or worry. It was the last ball of the season, a tradition held every December, when the world was dark by 5, and hearts needed a reason to believe in warmth. She stood near the window, a girl in a gown that belonged to her grandmother, lace slightly frayed, pearls that remembered other winters. Her name was Eleanor. Not the kind of name you shout, but one you speak gently, like a prayer. She wasn't looking for magic, only a quiet night, and perhaps a moment that didn't feel borrowed. Across the room, he stood by the fireplace, tall, hesitant, his hands in his pockets, as if unsure whether to keep them or offer them to fate. His name was Thomas, a schoolteacher turned soldier turned schoolteacher again. He had danced once before in this very room, but that was before the world cracked open. Their eyes met in that way eyes do, when they carry matching loneliness. He didn't walk to her. He wandered, as though drawn not by intention but by echo. "Would you?" he asked, offering a hand, like someone placing trust on the table. She looked down at her worn shoes, then back at him. "Yes," she said, and the orchestra seemed to understand. They danced, not with flair or perfection, but like 2 people learning to be whole again. Around them, others spun with practiced ease. But Eleanor and Thomas moved as if afraid to wake the moment. Their steps were slow, their rhythm slightly unsure. Yet every stumble became part of the music. He told her about the village children he taught to read. She told him about books she'd hidden in attic boxes during air raids. He laughed like he hadn't in years. She smiled like it hurt a little, as if joy had grown foreign on her face. When the snow thickened outside and the windows blurred with frost, they slipped out onto the terrace. Breath turned to fog, fingers turned to courage. "I used to dream of things like this," he said, "but I never imagined they could be this quiet." She looked at him then, really looked, and in the glow of falling snow, saw not just a man, but a shelter. "I think," she whispered, "the quiet is what makes it real." They didn't kiss. Not then. They simply stood close enough for their warmth to blur the cold. And when the bell tolled midnight, the winter ball ended. But the moment didn't. Years later, someone found a photograph in an old chest. Two people on a snowy terrace. No names written, no date, just smiles that suggested they once stood still while the world kept spinning. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The train ride that changed everything. It began not with thunder, but with the low, steady murmur of wheels against iron, a lullaby for the restless. It was a winter morning, pale and undecided. The fog was thick, and the sky seemed to yawn open slowly, as if it too was reluctant to begin the day. She boarded the train at platform 6, carrying a suitcase older than her memories, and a letter she hadn't yet decided to send. Her name was Clara, a name like a candle, quiet, glowing, easy to miss unless you were looking for warmth. She took her seat by the window, wrapped in a coat too large for her frame, with pockets full of silence. The train heaved forward, sighing into motion like an old man recalling a love story. He boarded at the next stop, hands dusted with charcoal, eyes like the storm before the sea calms. His name was Elias, a name that carried weight, but spoke gently. He sat across from her, the only other passenger in that sleepy carriage, a book in his hands, unread. They exchanged the kind of smile strangers give, polite, fleeting, a promise not to intrude. But then came the tunnel, a long one, where the world disappeared, and the carriage turned into a confessional of flickering lights and heartbeats. When they emerged into daylight again, something had shifted. She was no longer just a girl in a coat. He was no longer just a man with a book. She spoke first. "Do you believe some people are meant to meet? Only once, but just at the right time?" He looked at her, his gaze patient as moonlight. "Yes," he said, "and sometimes once is enough." They spoke in the language of soft pauses, about poems that changed them, about dreams they'd left in old apartments, about regrets they hadn't yet learned to forgive. He told her about a woman he had almost loved, but never truly reached. She told him about a boy who'd promised to wait, then forgot how. There was no need for names, no past tense wounds reopened, only shared understanding. Like two ships passing and choosing, for once, to anchor. Outside, snow began to fall. Not heavily, just enough to remind the world that even endings can be beautiful. She leaned her head against the window. He placed his glove near hers on the seat between them, not touching, but close enough to feel the heat of presence. As the train neared her stop, she folded the letter in her pocket. "I think I don't need to send it anymore," she whispered. Elias nodded, not as a reply, but as a benediction. The train slowed. She stood, and just before stepping onto the platform, she turned back. "I'll remember this," she said. Not a goodbye, just a truth. The doors closed, the train pulled away, and in that space of in-between, a quiet love, brief, unnamed, was born and left behind, like footprints in falling snow. Sometimes, the most permanent moments are the ones that never repeat. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Love letters found in a dusty attic. The attic had not been opened in years. It sighed as the door creaked, a slow exhale of time and dust and memories that had been waiting patiently beneath cobwebs. Anna was there, wrapped in the kind of silence you only find in old houses. She was not looking for anything in particular, only sorting through boxes left behind after her grandmother passed on. The air smelled of dry wood, of pages yellowed by the sun, of winters that never quite reached this high. There, beneath a box marked Christmas decorations, she found it. A shoebox wrapped in twine, soft with age. Inside, letters, Dozens of them, tied together with a silk ribbon faded into something between gray and memory. They weren't addressed to her, but to a woman named Eleanor, her grandmother. And the sender? Every envelope bore the same signature. Yours always, Thomas. She sat down right there on the wooden floor, sunlight filtering through the cracks in the roof, painting golden bars of time across her hands. She read the first one, the 12th of August, 1943. My dearest Eleanor, today the sea was quiet, but my heart was not. His words spilled like water over stones. Gentle, aching, true. He wrote from ships, from cities torn by war, from hospital beds and rain-drenched alleys. He wrote with longing that had no calendar. I see your face in the clouds, in the steam of morning tea, in the quiet spaces between footsteps. Each letter became a breath from a world she had never known. Thomas was not her grandfather. That much she knew. Her grandmother had married a man named Richard, a kind, quiet man who built furniture and never spoke of the past. But here, in ink that had not faded, was another man, another love, one that never made it into photo albums, but bloomed in the shadows. Anna kept reading. Letters filled with poems, sketches of pressed flowers, sudden bursts of worry, when Eleanor hadn't replied. Then, silence. A final envelope, not dated, just one line. I understand now, but I will always keep the door open, in case you ever wish to walk back through. That was the last. Anna sat still. The world around her had not changed, but something inside her had. What happens to love that never got its ending? Does it vanish? Or does it wait in boxes, in corners of attics, whispering itself into the dust, until someone finds it again? She didn't know the answer, but she wrapped the letters carefully, retied the ribbon, and carried them downstairs. That night, she lit a candle and wrote a letter of her own, not to Thomas, not even to Eleanor, but to love itself, to all the quiet, secret things we never speak aloud, to moments that passed, but never left. Sometimes, we don't need to understand a story, to feel it move through us. Sometimes, we just need to remember that love, once written, never truly disappears. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The girl who waited by the lighthouse. There is a lighthouse that stands alone, its stones worn smooth by wind and sea, its light turning in slow, thoughtful circles. A heartbeat of the coast. They say it has watched over the cliffs for more than 100 years, but no one lives there now. Not officially. But sometimes, if you climb the winding path at dusk, you might see her. A girl with a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, a notebook in her lap, and a distant look in her eyes. She comes with the tide. Her name is Clara, though no one remembers how long she's been waiting. The locals say she first appeared after a storm, the kind that rearranges coastlines and hearts. That night, a ship had gone missing, a small vessel with white sails and a name no one speaks anymore. Clara was supposed to be on it, but at the last moment, her heart tugged her ashore, and some whisper, some invisible pull, told her to stay behind. She watched the boat disappear beyond the fog, promising she would follow the next day. But the next day never came, and neither did the boat. Now, every evening, Clara returns to the lighthouse. She sits just beneath the lantern, its great golden eye casting circles into the sea. She writes letters in her notebook, as if the waves might carry them, to the one soul she still hopes to find. My dearest. One letter reads, I watched the stars fall into the ocean last night. They whispered that you were near. She writes of the scent of salt, of dreams that smell like rope and pine wood, of voices carried on the wind that might belong to him. She writes not as someone stuck in time, but as someone who remembers love, as something too large for clocks. Years pass. The lighthouse falls into disrepair. The path becomes overgrown, but Clara still walks it. Barefoot, unhurried, she brings tea in a small thermos. She hums to the sea, and always, she waits. She has become part of the landscape, like the gulls, like the tide, like the wind that combs through grass, and forgets what it was looking for. Some say she is a ghost. Others say she is just a girl who never stopped believing that love would return, if only she waited long enough. And perhaps she is both. Because one night, only one, a fisherman swore he saw a lantern, not from the lighthouse, but from a boat far out at sea. White sails, a single figure on the deck, and the light, it blinked once, as if in reply. Clara didn't say anything the next day, but her shawl looked freshly washed, and the lines around her eyes had softened. She smiled, as if some wordless promise had finally returned to her. And though she still climbed the hill, her waiting no longer felt like longing, but like love, spilling quietly over the edge of time. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The cafe where time stood still. There is a street in a city you've never quite visited, lined with cobblestones that sigh when you step on them. And if you walk it slowly, truly slowly, you may pass a small cafe, tucked between a forgotten bookstore and a florist that only opens when it rains. There is no sign outside, no hours posted, and yet, it's always open, but only when you need it. They say the cafe exists on the edge of time, not ahead, not behind, just beside it, as if the present moment paused, took a breath, and decided to sit down for a cup of something warm. Inside, the air smells like cinnamon and memory. Chairs don't match. The teacups are all chipped differently, and the walls are covered with old love notes, taped up like wallpaper. Some are stained with coffee, some with tears, but all speak of hearts that once beat a little faster. At the far end of the room, there is a table near the window. It catches the morning light in winter and listens to the rain in summer. Two people used to sit there. No one ever knew their names. They never held hands, never touched, but something shimmered in the quiet space between them. He always arrived first. A tall man with a coat too large for his frame, carrying a leather-bound book he never opened. She would appear 10 minutes later, as though timed to the tilt of the sun, with wind in her hair and a soft red scarf she never removed. They never ordered the same thing twice. One day, rose tea. Another day, hot chocolate with a dash of chili. They let the menu decide for them, as if even that was part of the ritual of being there. They didn't speak much, but when they did, the air around them seemed to hush, leaning in like a curious friend. They spoke about dreams they'd never follow, cities they'd never visit, lives they could have lived if they'd met in another time. And yet, here they were, not in the past, not in the future, but here, in this strange, still moment, where the world held its breath, just long enough for them to be something more than what life had allowed. Some said they were lovers separated by fate. Others believed they were strangers, drawn together by the gravity of something forgotten. But the truth, if there is such a thing, is that they were simply two people who understood the beauty of pauses and of silence not meant to be filled. Then, one day, only one of them came. She sat by the window alone, her red scarf folded in her lap. She ordered rose tea. She left behind a single letter on the table, pressed beneath the weight of her teacup. No one read it. No one dared. But the cafe has never been the same since. The table remains empty now, waiting, perhaps, for the right two souls to sit down and stop time again. If you ever find yourself on that quiet street, with the cobblestones sighing under your feet and the scent of old roses in the wind, step inside. Take the seat by the window. Order something unfamiliar. And listen closely. Time might just wait with you. Long enough. To remind you what love once felt like, when no one was watching. Now, let's move on to the next chapter, the tailor and the ballet dancer. In a tucked-away corner of a timeless European city, down a lane dusted with lavender and soft light, there lived a tailor, not famous, not loud, but known to those who valued care, precision, and quiet kindness. His shop was small, no signboard, just a faded curtain in the window, and a bell that chimed like a whisper when the door opened. He stitched not just with thread, but with memory. He could mend more than fabric. He could mend time. The kind of man who remembered your name, your favorite fabric, and the story behind the tear in your sleeve. One rainy afternoon, she arrived, a ballet dancer with aching ankles and eyes that held entire symphonies. She was not dressed like a muse, in simple black and damp shoes, but something about her carried rhythm, even when she was still. She held out a torn rehearsal skirt, soft blue, tulle worn thin. "I can't dance in it," she said, "but I can't bear to throw it away." He didn't ask questions. He just ran his fingers over the fraying edge, as if feeling the music caught in the weave. He looked up, gently. "Then we won't throw it away." From that moment, she returned often, not always with something to mend, but sometimes just to sit, to breathe, to let the silence wrap around her like a shawl. She told him about her world of mirrors and music, the silent sacrifices, the way her feet no longer sang the way they used to. He spoke little, but he listened with his entire being, as if her words were delicate stitches. He dared not pull too tightly. He began designing pieces for her, quietly, without being asked. Dresses that flowed like sighs, soft shawls that whispered across her shoulders. "I just try to imagine," he once said, "how movement might feel when it's free of pain." She smiled then, not the smile she wore for audiences, but the one she kept for herself. And slowly, something invisible formed, between hemmed silences and shared cups of tea. Not romance as the world would name it, but a gentler thread, a companionship rooted in deep noticing. One winter, she stopped coming. The bell above the door stayed quiet. He hemmed without music, stitched without stories. Weeks passed. Then, one snowy evening, a small box appeared on his doorstep. Inside, a pair of worn ballet slippers, and a note. "They've carried me through every leap, every fall, every stage light and lonely curtain. I don't know how to dance anymore, but I remember how it felt when you looked at me, as if I never had to perform again." No signature, but he knew. He placed the slippers in the window, beneath the faded curtain. They sit there still, a small reminder that sometimes the greatest partnerships aren't choreographed or confessed, but simply lived. So, if you ever pass by a quiet shop on a lavender street where the bell chimes like a sigh, look in the window. You may see shoes that have known a stage, and a man who sews, not just fabric, but feeling. And for a moment, time. Again, we'll pause. Now, let's move on to the next chapter, the florist who left notes in bouquets. There is something eternally soft about a flower shop in the early morning. Before the city fully wakes, before the sun spills over the windowsill, there is only the hum of quiet labor. Scissors whispering through stems, water lapping softly in silver buckets, and the delicate rustle of petals being arranged like lullabies. In one such shop, tucked between a bakery and a faded cinema, there worked a florist named Emil. He was quiet, not out of shyness, but reverence, as though words themselves were too loud for the beauty he worked with. Every bouquet was a love letter, not the kind scribbled on paper, but written in iris and peony, in the curling language of fern leaves and pale ranunculus. He had a habit no one quite understood. Beneath the binding ribbon of every bouquet, he'd tuck a small, handwritten note, not signed, not addressed, just a thought, a line of poetry, a single sentence of hope, a question that made the heart tilt gently sideways. Sometimes they said, "Remember the time you didn't give up?" Or, "The moon still remembers your name." Other times, "I know it still aches, but you're not broken." No one knew who they were for. Perhaps no one in particular. Perhaps everyone. Some returned to the shop just to say thank you. Others never noticed. But a few came back with tears caught between eyelashes, and something softer in their voice. One spring afternoon, a woman arrived. She was tall, with windswept hair and an air of searching. She didn't look like she belonged in a flower shop. But grief has a way of sending us to strange places, in search of gentleness. She picked up a bouquet of white lilacs and eucalyptus. The note tucked beneath the ribbon read, "Grief is love's echo. Let it speak." She stood still for a long moment, then placed the bouquet to her chest, as if it had spoken a name she hadn't said aloud in years. She returned the next day, and the day after that. Sometimes to buy, sometimes just to sit and breathe the air soaked in jasmine and soil. Emile never asked. He only smiled with eyes that understood. One day, she brought him a book of poetry. Her own. Inside, a dedication. "To the stranger who reminded me that I am still alive." He read each poem slowly, like watering roots with care. She never saw the tears that lined the pages after. Months passed. The notes kept coming. One in particular read, "Someone is reading your silence like scripture." It was found by an elderly man who had lost his wife. He brought the bouquet back the next week, dried, preserved, and said, "She would have loved this." Another, "You are still allowed to begin again." It reached a young man who had just left a job, a home, a version of himself he could no longer hold up. He wrote a letter to the shop. "I came in for tulips. I left with a reason to try again." No one ever knew Emile's story. Not really. Some say he had once loved someone who vanished into the pages of a season, never to return. Others believe he was simply born tender, one of those rare souls who feels the aches of the world and wraps them, gently, in petal and prose. What's certain is this: every person who walked into that shop left carrying more than flowers. They carried a message, a mirror, a reminder that the softest things in life, words, petals, hope, often carry the heaviest healing. And somewhere, perhaps still, there's a flower shop breathing quietly on a sleepy street, where notes are tucked under ribbon, like wishes folded into wings. And maybe, just maybe, one day, you'll find one, two. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The couple who met every year on the same day. There is a kind of love that doesn't rush. It doesn't burn wild like a summer storm, nor fade like forgotten sunlight. It simply returns, like the tide, like the bloom of spring crocus after snow, on the same day each year. In a little town with cobbled streets and sleepy cafes, two souls met, always at the same place. A bench beneath an old fig tree, beside the lake that never forgot their laughter. Her name was Clara. His was Julien. And though the world had tried to keep them apart, distance, duty, the ceaseless demands of time, they had made a vow not written in rings or papers. Only this: meet me here, every year, on the 7th of May, no matter what. It started as something light, a whim of two young hearts swept up in summer's dance. But the years grew roots under the promise, and even as seasons shifted, they returned. Always. Sometimes they had hours, sometimes only minutes, sometimes in laughter, sometimes in tears. One year, Clara arrived with her arm in a sling, smiling through the pain, saying, "Life tried, but I'm still here." Another year, Julien came with a deep scar just beneath his collar, his hands shaking slightly as he passed her a daisy. "It was close," he whispered, "but not close enough to stop me." They never asked each other to stay. They never tried to trap time. Instead, they let love stretch between them like the sky, vast, open, and full of waiting stars. Each year, the town changed a little. The fig tree grew broader. The cafe replaced its chairs. New lovers came and went. But their bench remained. And in that space, for just one day a year, they were whole again. Strangers often watched them from afar, noticing the way they didn't need to fill silence, how their glances carried the weight of unsaid years, how even in stillness, they pulsed with something that felt like home. One year, Clara arrived with streaks of silver in her hair. She sat for a long time before Julian appeared. His steps were slower, but his smile, unchanged. "I thought you might not come," she said. "I thought the same about you," he replied. Then they laughed, that laugh that still echoed like it had decades ago. They shared tea, watched ducks skate across the lake, said little. Because sometimes, the greatest love stories are not lived every day. They are lived deeply, and then paused, until the heart calls again. Eventually, one year, only one figure sat on the bench. She placed a letter beside her, folded carefully, tied with a ribbon the color of dawn. To whomever found it, it read, "We loved without needing always. We met each year, like the moon meets the tide. And even now, if I sit long enough, he still arrives in the rustle of leaves, in the hush between heartbeats. Some loves don't end. They just change the way they arrive." Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The first love you never forget. There's a love that comes early, before we understand ourselves, before the world teaches us how to hold back. It arrives like spring after a long winter, unexpected, tender, and strangely infinite. Your first love. You don't remember the moment you first saw them. You remember the feeling. The sudden stillness in a crowded room, the way the air folded itself gently around your breath, as if the universe had exhaled just for this encounter. They were not perfect, but they were everything. A constellation your heart charted with the awe of a stargazer. Their voice became your favorite sound. Their smile a kind of sunrise you waited for each morning. It was clumsy, wasn't it? How you held your emotions like 2 full cups of tea, always spilling a little over the edge, blushing too quickly, laughing too loudly, wanting too deeply. And oh, the first time they looked at you, as if you were more than just another passing face, a glance that cracked open a hidden chamber in your chest and filled it with light. The hours you spent thinking about them outnumbered the stars. You built entire lifetimes in your head, conversations that never happened, moments that existed only in the quiet cinema of your thoughts. And then, maybe it ended. Most first loves do. Maybe it faded slowly, like ink in an old diary. Or maybe it shattered, suddenly, sharply, leaving behind a silence you didn't know how to name. You told yourself it was just young love. That time would soften the corners, blur the face. And in some ways, it did. You moved on. You grew. You loved again. But now and then, on a quiet night, or when a certain song plays, you remember. Not them, but you, the version of yourself that bloomed in their presence. Innocent, open, unbruised. You remember how you loved without strategy, without fear, without needing to protect your heart like a fragile artifact. And that's why the first love never leaves, because it held the blueprint of who you were, before the world taught you how to hide. Maybe you haven't spoken in years. Maybe they're a name you haven't said aloud since you were 17. But in some secret garden inside you, their memory still grows. Not as a ghost, but as a gentle echo. Not all love is meant to stay. Some is meant to awaken. Your first love did that. They opened a door. They lit a candle. And even now, as you fall asleep, some part of you still glows. With the warmth of that early flame, you can close your eyes, knowing that you've loved deeply. And once upon a time, before anything else, you learned how to feel alive. Now, Let's move on to the next chapter. Long-distance love. During a war, there is a kind of love that survives not by presence, but by longing. Not by touch, but by faith. A love that lives in the pause between letters, in the quiet before the postman's footsteps. It is the love born in wartime, the kind that writes itself between goodbyes and hope. He left in autumn. The trees were still burning gold when he kissed her for the last time at the station. He wore the uniform like a second skin, but his eyes were just a boy's, searching hers as if to memorize them for every night ahead. She pressed something small into his palm, a token, a locket, a ribbon, and whispered something only the wind between them could carry. Trains sighed, steam rose, and with it, a part of her heart vanished into the gray distance. Their love became ink and paper, each letter a heartbeat, each envelope a lifeline. My darling, he would begin. The stars out here are colder, but I still imagine your breath in the frost. She wrote by candlelight, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the unbearable quiet of missing someone, whose heartbeat she could only remember. The war had no kindness. It erased names, rewrote fates, and interrupted dreams like a cruel editor tearing out pages. But their letters kept arriving, sometimes weeks late, sometimes weather-worn, but they came. I still hear your laugh in the rain, she wrote. I bake the bread you used to love, though I eat it alone. Love in wartime is not made of roses or moonlight. It is made of waiting, of rationed words and rationed hope, of counting down days that have no names, of praying not just for peace, but for one more letter, one more line, one more proof of life. And yet, the distance didn't kill the love. It distilled it. Every word became sacred. Every memory, a holy thing. She wore his sweater, even in spring. He traced her handwriting with calloused fingers, as if it could warm his skin in the trenches. In a time where everything could be taken, love was what they kept. A rebellion made of paper, an empire of feelings held up by thread. One night, when the world was still and the sky above him held too many stars, he wrote, If I don't come back, know that I loved you as fiercely as a man could love across oceans and gunfire. And if I do, I'll marry you beneath the trees that once saw us say goodbye. She read that letter 1,000 times. Each time, her hands grew steadier. Each time, her heart beat louder. In the end, he came home, changed, thinner, eyes heavier. But when he saw her on the platform, everything cracked open. The war fell away. The years folded in. She didn't run. She walked. Slow, like she had all the time in the world now. He dropped his bag, and when they touched, it was not like fireworks. It was like gravity. Two halves pulled back into wholeness. Not all stories end this way. Some don't get the kiss, the return, the happy silence of post-war life. But love, real love, it doesn't need an ending to be true. It just needs a heart strong enough to wait, and a soul brave enough to believe. Even now, long after the war, long after the letters have yellowed, their love is remembered in the way they held hands, quietly, in a world that finally knew peace. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. A love that faded but never left. Some love stories don't end with a crash. They don't shatter. They don't explode into betrayal or unravel with cruelty. They simply dissolve, quietly, softly, like mist at sunrise, still beautiful as it disappears. You knew this love, not in your bones perhaps, but in your silence. It was the kind of love that crept in gently, settled like warm light through a window, and lingered long after the words stopped flowing. You met in a time when everything felt like possibility. Two hearts, curious, cautious, drawn like tides to the pull of something invisible. The way they smiled at you, like you were the only real thing in a room full of noise. It made you believe in quiet magic, in moments that don't need names, in the feeling of being seen. It was never perfect, but it was tender. There were coffees gone cold from talking too long, shared dreams spoken under breath, rainy afternoons with fingers just barely touching. That love, the one you once held. It lived in the in-between, not in declarations, but in gentle knowing. But time, as it often does, wasn't patient. Life moved forward, and so did you. Not in anger, not even in pain, just separately. You stopped finishing each other's thoughts. The laughter came less easily. The quiet between you grew, not like comfort anymore, but like distance. And still, no one said the words. No one said it was over. Because maybe, deep down, you both hoped it wasn't. Maybe you still do. Some nights, you find them in the smallest places. In the scent of a book's worn pages, in the shape of a shadow cast across a kitchen floor, in a song that hits too precisely at just the wrong time. They don't haunt you. They don't hurt you. But they remain. Because some love doesn't leave. It just changes shape. It becomes the thread in your favorite sweater. The way you now stir your tea. The kind of stories you write. That love, though faded, planted seeds of gentleness, of depth, of the knowledge that you are someone worth being loved that way. And maybe that's what love is too. Not just the ones that last, but the ones that leave you better, quieter, softer, more you. Sometimes, when the night is quiet enough, you still hear them laugh. Not like a ghost, but like a blessing. You smile without even noticing. You hold that memory, not with regret, but with reverence. You don't miss the person, not exactly. You miss who you were when you were loved like that. And that, too, is love. Even if it's long gone, it's okay to carry it. It doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. It makes you someone who has loved deeply and let go gently. You walk forward now with open hands, but somewhere in your chest, that faded love hums like a distant lullaby. One that knows your name. One that never needed to say goodbye. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Love in the silence of an old town. There are places where time pauses. Not stops, not halts, but slows just enough for you to notice it breathing. In an old town nestled between the hills and the sea, there's a silence that speaks louder than any voice. Not an empty silence, but one filled with knowing. Like the hush inside a cathedral. Like the stillness of two people who understand each other without saying a word. You've walked those streets before, perhaps in dream, perhaps in truth. Narrow alleyways kissed by ivy. Window panes glowing gold in twilight. A bakery that always smells like cinnamon and first chances. And somewhere along those worn stone paths, love lived. It didn't announce itself. It didn't need to. It moved gently, like the breeze between buildings, like music heard faintly from an open window. You met in a place where everything was aged and beautiful, where every crack in the wall held a story, where time curled around lovers like a shawl. You didn't fall in love all at once. It happened slowly, like tea steeping in silence, like watching paint dry on a sun-warmed windowsill, like the slow peeling back of layers, until there was nothing left but truth. You sat together on benches too old to bear weight, laughing softly at nothing at all. You passed notes on napkins. You kissed beneath lantern light. You danced in kitchens while bread baked, with the world moving quietly outside your window. And yet, this town, this place, was always quieter than you expected. There were no horns blaring, no crowds surging, just the sound of your footsteps, and theirs, meeting and parting across tiled floors. Over time, that silence grew, not in discomfort, but in depth, the kind of silence that holds 1,000 thoughts, the kind of quiet that lovers share when there's nothing left to prove. But love, like silence, can be misunderstood. They began to listen more to the hush than to your heart. They heard worry where you offered peace. You misread their pauses as distance when they were really offering space. And slowly, without blame, you drifted. Now, the town remains, just as it was. The buildings still lean lovingly on one another. The sea still sighs just beyond the hills. The bakery still opens at dawn. But now, you walk alone. And yet, it's not loneliness you feel. It's something deeper, something quieter. You feel the love that still lingers between shutters and door frames. In the way the light slants through the same old church window. In the chair that no one else dares sit in. In the silence, because in that silence, they are still there. Not in body, but in presence. In memory. In the echo of laughter against cobblestones. In the way you still order for two out of habit. In how your hand hovers for a moment too long, reaching for a hand that's not there. Some loves do not leave scars. They leave shadows, soft silhouettes, where something beautiful once stood. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the town itself was always the third presence in your love. The witness, the keeper of your silence, the gentle container of what bloomed and what faded. Now, you walk with a different rhythm. Not with mourning, but with memory. Not with regret, but with reverence. Love in an old town doesn't die. It becomes part of the architecture. It weaves into walls, into lanterns, into the stillness of a quiet morning. And when you return, because somehow you always do, you don't need to speak. The town remembers for you. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The man who wrote her poems every Sunday. He wasn't famous. He wasn't published. But every Sunday morning, without fail, he sat by the window and wrote her a poem. The world outside would wake slowly. Sunlight melting through curtains, church bells echoing in the distance, birds busy in their quiet conversations. And there he would be. A cup of coffee cooling beside him, a stack of yellowed pages, and a heart that had something to say. He never asked for the poems to be read aloud. He didn't insist on a response. He simply wrote, week after week, month after month, year after year, as though love, to him, was best spoken softly, and most truthfully through verse. At first, they were poems of discovery, lines filled with wonder at how her eyes caught the morning sun, how her laughter turned the ordinary into gold, how her presence made his chest feel full, not with excitement, but with peace. She would find them folded neatly beside the kettle, or slipped into the pages of the book she was reading, sometimes tucked in her coat pocket, like a secret message between strangers who had chosen each other. And every Sunday, she smiled, not because the poems were perfect. They weren't. Sometimes the metaphors were strange, the rhymes a bit forced, the rhythm a little off, but they were hers, and she knew they came from a place inside him that only she had been allowed to see. Over time, life grew louder. Children came, bills stacked, responsibilities pressed in like uninvited guests. There were arguments, moments of silence not filled with understanding, but with weariness. Still, every Sunday, the poems arrived, even when they slept back to back, even when words were few between them, even when she forgot how to say thank you. He wrote, because love, to him, wasn't a feeling that passed through the body like a fever. It was a practice, a ritual, a vow renewed in pen and paper. The poems evolved. They spoke of wrinkles and gray hairs, of shared grief and fragile hope, of watching their children leave and the house grow quiet again, of watching her brush her hair in the mirror, still with the same gentle grace. And one day, she woke up to find the poem missing. At first, she thought he had forgotten, that maybe Saturday had exhausted him, or perhaps the muse had not visited. But then she noticed the stillness, the untouched coffee cup, the empty chair by the window, and she knew. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was sacred. It was the weight of every poem, every line, every Sunday morning they had shared, settling into the fabric of her soul. She found the final poem days later, folded, as always, but sealed in an envelope marked simply, "For when you need to remember." And inside, it said, "I wrote you love, in small stanzas, so it wouldn't overwhelm you. I wrote you peace in broken rhyme, so you'd never feel the need to be perfect. I wrote you always, every Sunday, so you'd never forget that I chose you, again and again and again. Now," she writes, "not every Sunday, not every week, but sometimes, when the light hits the window just right, she takes a pen and whispers back, 'Now, let's move on to the next chapter.'" The story of a couple who grew old together. There are no fireworks in this story. No grand declarations shouted across rain-drenched streets. No wild flights or impulsive escapes. No viral moments. No cinematic climax. Only two people who met once, chose each other, and never stopped choosing. It began simply. A glance in a quiet room. A conversation that didn't try too hard. A connection that felt like a familiar melody. You didn't know you had already memorized. He liked her quiet presence, how she didn't fill every silence with noise, but with warmth. She liked the way he listened, really listened, as if each word she spoke deserved a seat at the table of his thoughts. Their love wasn't explosive. It was a slow-burning hearth, lit on an ordinary day, and kept alive by 1,000 small gestures. They learned to dance together, not on stages, but in kitchens and living rooms, to music only they could hear. They disagreed. Of course they did. There were slammed doors, midnight apologies, moments when it felt like the space between them stretched too far to cross. But still, they stayed. Because love, for them, wasn't about never breaking. It was about always mending. They grew a life. Not perfectly, but with care. Holidays came and went. Birthdays were quietly celebrated. Groceries were bought. Bills paid. Laundry folded. They built routines that became rituals. Morning coffee together on the porch. Sunday walks through the park, the way they always reached for each other's hands. In the movie theater, even after 50 years. Time passed, as it always does. The skin changed. The pace slowed. The world around them evolved. They watched the rise of technologies they didn't understand. Saw buildings change. Friends fade. Familiar streets lose their charm. But they remained, anchored to each other, like two trees whose roots had long since intertwined beneath the earth. Some days were joyful, filled with laughter, grandchildren, songs on the radio. Others were quiet, marked by doctors' visits, aching joints, and soft goodbyes to people they loved. But still, they found beauty. They discovered the comfort of a shared silence, the wonder of watching someone you love brush their teeth, read a book, hum while washing dishes. The intimacy of growing old together wasn't in what they did, but in the presence they offered. He still brought her tea in the morning. She still laid out his sweater when it was cold. Even when her memory started to falter, even when his steps became unsteady, there was a thread between them, unbroken, invisible, stronger than time. And when the end came, as it always does, it was met with hands entwined, a whispered, "Thank you," and a heart full of everything they had built, without needing to prove it to anyone else. At her funeral, he sat in the front row with trembling hands. A friend placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You two had something rare." He smiled through tears, not because it was rare, but because they never stopped watering it. Love like that isn't loud. It doesn't always write poems or climb balconies. It stays. It shows up. It grows roots. And when it blooms, quietly, the world is better for it. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. A memory of love from a lost photograph. It was buried in a box. A forgotten shoebox tucked beneath old coats in the attic, filled with dust, brittle paper, and the scent of years past. Inside, a photograph. Edges curled, color faded, But there they were, two figures, smiling, holding hands, caught in the golden hush of a sunset. No one remembered taking. He didn't recognize the background. A park, maybe, or a street now long gone. But he remembered the girl, her face like the warmth of spring after a long winter, the way her eyes looked directly into the camera, and yet somehow, also, directly into him. He sat with the photo in his hands for a long time. Funny how memory works, how something forgotten for decades can crack open a window in your soul. Her name had been Lily, and she had laughed like it was music meant just for him. They had met in the spring of 2067, when everything felt possible and the world tasted like freedom. He was working at a local bookstore, stacking novels, stealing glances at poetry. She came in one rainy afternoon, soaked to the bone, asking for something that would make her believe in love again. He gave her Neruda. She gave him a smile that made his heart forget how to be cautious. They spent that summer wandering through second-hand shops and sleepy gardens, writing their names in fogged-up windows, and pretending time would never touch them. They were young, so young, but their love felt ancient, like it belonged in sepia tones and handwritten letters. They carved their initials into the bark of an old oak tree, swore they'd return every year, swore a lot of things. But life has its own rhythm, and not all love stories stretch across the pages of forever. She had to move. Family reasons. He had a job offer he couldn't turn down. They wrote letters, long ones, beautiful ones. But even ink begins to fade when held up to distance. Eventually, they stopped. No fight, no betrayal, just life. And yet, now, here she was again, smiling up at him from a world that no longer existed. He wondered if she had gotten married, had children, if she ever thought of that bookstore, or the smell of the rain that day. He placed the photo gently on the table beside him, as if it were sacred. That night, he dreamt of her, not as she was in the picture, but older laugh lines around her eyes, a softness in her voice that comes only with time. In the dream, they didn't speak. They just sat together on a bench under the old oak tree, the one where their initials still waited, hidden in the quiet rings of wood and time. Sometimes, love isn't meant to last in form. Sometimes it exists to mark us, to teach us the texture of longing, the weight of what-ifs, and the sweetness of memory. The photograph never found its way back into the box. He placed it in a small wooden frame and set it on the windowsill where the morning sun would greet it, because some loves, even if lost, still deserve a little light. Now, let's move on to the next chapter, the woman who loved too gently. There are those who love loudly, with fireworks and declarations, with grand gestures and shouting from rooftops. And then, there are those who love, like a slow breeze across still water, barely a ripple, yet the lake remembers. She was one of those, the woman who loved too gently, not because her love was small, not because it was timid, but because her heart was built like a sanctuary, quiet, sacred, always open, even when no one noticed. Her name was Mara, and she had the kind of presence that you might miss if you weren't paying attention, the kind of smile that bloomed slowly, like a flower opening not for the world, but for the morning light. She loved a man who never fully saw her, not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know how to look. He was drawn to brightness, to the loudness of life. He loved stormy conversations and wild passions. He mistook Mara's stillness for distance, her softness for indifference. But Mara, she loved in the little ways, in the extra sugar she remembered for his coffee, in the books she left by his bedside, in the way she listened to his silences, even more than his words. She never said, "I love you," the way people expect, but she showed it in every breath, every pause, every act of remembering. And still, he drifted, not out of cruelty, not even out of discontent, but because sometimes gentleness is mistaken for absence. And when he left, she didn't beg, didn't chase. She just stood at the window for a long time, watching the space he no longer filled. She cried softly, like rain on a quiet evening. Not a storm, not a flood, just enough to remember. That love, real love, still aches when it's alone. Years passed. People came and went. Some stayed for a while. Some left echoes. But Mara remained the same, loving in that slow, careful way that the world often forgets to value. She grew older, wiser, quieter. Somehow, but her heart remained open, not bruised, not bitter, just quietly full. And then, one day, he came back, older too, tired in a way only time understands. He had known love since her, but nothing had stayed. Nothing had held him the way she did, without ever holding too tight. He looked into her eyes, the same soft eyes that had once watched him leave. And this time, he saw her, truly saw her. Not just the surface, but the depth, the love that had never tried to possess, that had never demanded, that had simply been there, waiting, like sunlight on a windowsill, waiting for someone to notice the warmth. They didn't speak much that afternoon. They didn't need to, because sometimes love is not in the words, but in the space between them. And Mara, she smiled that slow, blooming smile again, still soft, still gentle, but no longer unseen, because those who love gently often carry the deepest oceans, quiet, vast, and eternal. Now, let's move on to the next chapter, when two strangers fell in love on a train. It began with a ticket, a window seat, and the hush of a morning train slicing through fog. Two strangers, drawn together by fate or perhaps something smaller, more delicate, like coincidence wrapped in silk. She boarded in the rain, carrying a book she never opened. He was already seated, watching the drizzle chase itself down the glass. They didn't speak at first. Strangers rarely do. They existed in parallel, two separate stories, stitched into the same moment. She noticed the way he tilted his head slightly when he read, as if listening to the words with his whole body. He noticed the softness in her sigh, like someone who'd been waiting a long time for something she couldn't name. The train moved on, through wheat fields, under bridges, past quiet villages still wrapped in sleep. Outside, motion and blur. Inside, stillness and quiet curiosity. It wasn't love at first sight. It wasn't even a conversation. Just of a kindred quiet, of a shared solitude. She glanced at his watch. He noticed her chipped nail polish. Small details, fragments. But in this soft exchange of noticing, something began. It started with a smile, a hesitant offering. A flicker of warmth passed between them like a candle being lit. Then, a comment about the weather. The way the rain had turned to mist. How the world outside now looked like a dream. Their voices met like hands. Gentle. Cautious. Strangers, yes, but not for long. They spoke of little things. Books they meant to read. Trains they'd missed. Places they'd never seen but longed to. Each word peeled back a layer. She told him about a town where the stars looked close enough to touch. He told her about a song he heard once, and never found again. They laughed once, softly, like two people rediscovering what it meant to be heard. And just like that, the silence between them transformed, from awkward space into a tender stillness that held them like a shared secret. The journey was not long, a few hours at most, but time bent itself for them. Minutes deepened, moments lingered. Every glance became a memory before it ended. By the time the conductor announced her stop, the rain had stopped, but something else had started. She stood. He did too. There was no grand goodbye, no promises, only the kind of farewell that feels like the beginning of something, unwritten. She stepped off the train. He remained, But both knew. They had crossed paths not by chance, but by design. He watched as she disappeared into the crowd. She turned once, just for a moment. Their eyes met. A smile. The same smile from earlier, but now it meant more. And as the train pulled away, and her figure blurred into the distance, he touched the back of the seat, where her presence still lingered. Two strangers, briefly aligned, on a journey neither expected. A love not measured in years or vows, but in eye contact and laughter, in words that floated gently between stops. Some stories never need an ending, just a beginning that echoes softly for the rest of your life. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. A rainy day and the sound of goodbye. Rain has a way of remembering. It holds the scent of old promises, the echoes of quiet departures, the rhythm of hearts learning how to let go. This story unfolds on a street dappled with puddles, where the sky wept not out of sorrow, but as if to soften the edges of goodbye. They stood beneath a shared umbrella, not quite touching, not quite apart. The air between them was full of everything unspoken. She was leaving. Not forever, perhaps, but long enough for goodbye to feel heavier than either of them could carry. It wasn't a dramatic farewell. There were no sobs, no shouts, no dramatic music swelling in the background. Just the soft thrum of rain on canvas, the distant hum of cars rolling through wet streets, and the ticking clock inside their chests, reminding them that time moves, whether we're ready or not. He reached for her hand, fingertips brushing like leaves in passing wind. She held on like it might anchor her to the world they had shared, to laughter over mismatched mugs, to quiet afternoons folding laundry together, to late-night talks about everything and nothing. They were saying goodbye not to each other, but to a version of themselves that had only existed in that shared chapter. Sometimes love doesn't end with a break. It ends with a pause, a drifting, a knowing. He smiled, a slow, sad smile that didn't ask her to stay. And that, more than anything, was love. Because love, true love, never cages. It opens the door and watches, even when it hurts. She spoke first. Not much. Just a whisper. "I'll miss this." He nodded. "Me too." The umbrella shifted slightly. Raindrops caught in her hair like tiny constellations, and he resisted the urge to brush them away, knowing some gestures are harder to recover from. In the background, a bus hissed as it pulled to the curb. Time was nudging them forward. She stepped back. He didn't follow. Sometimes, the bravest thing love can do is stay behind. She turned once at the door. He raised a hand in farewell, but his eyes said everything his lips could not. And then she was gone, a blur behind foggy windows, a memory framed by falling rain. He stood there for a while, long after the bus had disappeared, long after the umbrella had collapsed at his side. Rain soaked through his shirt, but he barely felt it. Because loss doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. It hums like an old lullaby. It lingers in the spaces once filled by laughter. It echoes in the gentle tap of raindrops against a now empty window. And yet, this wasn't despair. It was gratitude for the love that had been, for the moments that had mattered, for the tenderness that still lived quietly in his every breath. You see, goodbyes aren't the end of love. They're the proof of it. They are the soft closing of a chapter, not the erasure of the story. So he walked home alone, wet shoes, squeaking, heart full, not broken, just open. And above him, the sky wept with him, not out of sadness, but as if to wash the world clean. For whatever came next. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Love in the Time of Empires. A bedtime story. There was a time when love whispered between the pillars of power, when hearts ached in marble corridors, and kingdoms rose and fell, while two souls simply longed for each other. This is not a story you'll find in history books. It is not carved into monuments or sung in royal anthems. It is hidden in the footnotes of ancient chronicles, between the lines of treaties and declarations. It is the story of a general and a scholar. One carried the burden of war, the other, the weight of truth. They met on a balcony in the capital city, under a sky pulsing with torchlight, the scent of jasmine clinging to the evening air. He wore a uniform heavy with medals. She carried scrolls filled with forgotten languages. Their worlds should not have collided, but fate, quiet, stubborn, and poetic, doesn't care for should. He spoke first. "Do you believe empires can love?" he asked, his voice half daring, half curious. She looked up, eyes steady. "Empires don't love. People do. Quietly, desperately, even when it costs them everything." From that moment, they met in the stillness between war councils and academic debates, in gardens after dusk, beneath tapestries and echoing libraries. Their love was a rebellion of softness, in a world sharpened by conquest. They never kissed in public, never exchanged letters. Their affection lived in glances, in the way her hand lingered on his sleeve. A moment too long. He taught her the names of stars seen from the Eastern Front. She read him poetry written by queens who had been forgotten. Together, they dreamed of peace, of a home without guards at the gate. But empires don't make space for tenderness, and history demands sacrifice. A battle was coming, one he could not refuse, one she could not condone. He stood at the threshold of her study, his armor gleaming like gilt. She refused to cry. "I have to go," he said. "I know," she replied. "Will you wait for me?" "No," she said, not unkindly. "I will remember you." That's more honest. And so he rode out, carrying her memory like a locket pressed against his heart, and she stayed behind, watching the smoke rise on the horizon, each plume a silent prayer. Years passed. The empire fractured. New rulers wore crowns heavy with unfamiliar names. And yet, in a quiet museum, far from the capital, a collection of scrolls was discovered. Tucked inside one was a single note, not signed, not dated. There was once a soldier who chose to love more than he chose to win. There was once a woman who dared to love a man who belonged to a kingdom. They never wrote their names in gold, but they existed, and that was enough. Some say the scroll was written by her. Some say it was found beside his sword. No one knows. But if you listen closely, on quiet nights, when the world is still and the weight of power feels far away, you can still hear their story. Soft as candlelight, bold as truth, enduring as love. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The empire of her eyes and the kingdom of his heart. There are empires that rise from the dust built with stone, sword, and decree. And then, there are empires born in a single glance, silent, sovereign, and undefeated. He was a cartographer, a maker of maps, a measurer of mountains, a chaser of borders. She was a portraitist, a painter of faces, a revealer of truths, an observer of souls. They met not in the glow of fate, but in the gray hush of a quiet commission. The queen had summoned both, him to redraw the empire's limits, and her to capture its ruler's essence in oil and pigment. But when they met, in that vast stone hall, with echoes hanging like cobwebs in the air, he didn't see the queen. He saw her eyes. They were not the color of any sea he had mapped, not the shade of any desert he had studied. They were unknowable, uncharted. And for a man who had traced every coastline, who had named valleys in foreign tongues, the unfamiliarity of her gaze felt like being born again. She, too, noticed him. Not the way his shoulders bore the weight of long travel, not the ink-stained fingers, not the silence he wore like armor, but the way his eyes lowered in reverence, as if every person he looked at was a cathedral. In that moment, She knew. He didn't just draw maps. He believed in them. In journeys. In finding one's place. Days passed. They shared the same palace wing. He drawing lines by candlelight. She blending shadows on canvas. Their paths crossed in courtyards. Their conversations tucked into corners. Like wildflowers in cracks of stone. He spoke of lands that smelled like cinnamon and wind. She spoke of faces she could no longer forget, even after the paint dried. She never told him that he, too, had become a face. She painted again and again in secret, not in portraits, but in fragments. The curve of his lip on a page's edge, his brow furrowed in thought beneath a rising moon. He never told her that he redrew the empire's borders, just slightly, so that a hill she once spoke of would never be cut in half. Instead of confessions, they gave each other subtler things. A stolen fig wrapped in cloth, a map annotated with poems, a sketch of her eyes hidden between atlases. But kingdoms are not kind to quiet lovers, the queen noticed, and like all rulers with too much time and too little trust, she questioned loyalty. He was sent away, to chart the northern wastes, where snow buried secrets deep. She was assigned a new post, a monastery on the coast, where silence was law and longing was prayer. They never said goodbye, just one last glance, enough for him to carry her empire in his chest, enough for her to paint his kingdom into her dreams. Years passed. His maps grew more detailed. Her paintings grew more haunted, but they never forgot. And on the edge of one map, beneath the mountain range no one ever crossed, in handwriting too small for any king to see, he had written, "The empire of her eyes still rules me." And in one unfinished painting, locked away in a chapel attic, there are no rulers, no palaces, just a man looking at a woman, his heart a kingdom, her gaze the sun that crowns it. And even now, when scholars debate the meaning of that painting, or decipher the script on that map, they miss the truth entirely. Because that empire, it never fell. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Where empires fall, love remains. Empires crumble. They always do. No matter how tall the walls are built, no matter how many names are etched into stone, no matter how fierce the banners flutter in war-bitten winds, the end always comes. Sometimes, it's a storm. Other times, a whisper, a crack in the marble, a silence in the streets, a forgetting. But love does not end the way empires do. When cities fall, when statues break, when libraries are lost to flame, love lingers like perfume on a forgotten scarf. There was once a scholar in the last years of the Alabaster Empire, a realm of gold, glass, and fragile peace. He spent his days copying poems into leather-bound books, his nights beneath a stained glass dome, watching stars flicker like quiet secrets. She was a rebel's daughter, not of war, but of thought. She questioned everything, the structure of power, the hush around history, the way love was always written by those who won. They met in the remains of an old amphitheater, where moss had overtaken the stage, and forgotten lines hung in the air like ghosts. He was writing. She was listening. He read a line aloud, not for an audience, but for the stone. She answered it, not with applause, but with a correction, a different ending, a better one. He laughed. She didn't smile. Not yet. They began meeting there often, he with scrolls, she with questions, he with theories, she with truths. He taught her the old dialects, the ones the empire tried to erase. She taught him how to listen, how to see the rot behind the marble. They fell in love like scholars do, quietly, in footnotes and shared glances across ruined halls. But the empire was dying, and dying empires demand loyalty. Even love became suspicious. He was summoned, accused of leaking forbidden texts. She was hunted for the words she dared to speak aloud. They ran to the mountains first, then the caves beneath the dunes, then the broken temple where no gods were left to watch. They wrote, to each other, to the future, to anyone who might one day ask. Did love survive this fall? And though the empire's last king ordered the burning of every archive, and though their names were struck from every ledger, one thing remained: a single stone tablet, buried beneath a collapsed wall, found centuries later by a wanderer with dust in his hair. It was carved in a script long forgotten, but the message needed no translation. Empires fall, but I remember your voice in the silence, and that is how I survive. Today, the Alabaster Empire is a line in a textbook, a half-remembered ruin on a tourist trail. But lovers still stand in that amphitheater, their hands touching the stone, wondering if someone once stood right there, speaking of love while the world fell apart around them. And the answer? Yes. Always yes. Empires fall. But love, the real kind, remains, like the warmth of a hand long after it is let go. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. In the archives of forgotten love, there are places where silence gathers like snow, where footsteps echo not because they are loud, but because the world around them has stopped listening. One such place lives beneath the ground, below the old capital city, where whispers once ruled over thunder. A forgotten archive, not of laws or legends, but of love. This was no grand library, no stained glass windows or marble staircases, just shelves carved into ancient stone, paper curled at the edges, ink faded like morning fog. And among those shelves wandered a keeper. She was not old, but her eyes had aged from reading too much loss. She had inherited the role from her grandmother, who inherited it from hers. Their task was simple, though never easy: to gather stories of love that history chose to forget. Not kings and queens, not great poets or mighty generals, but the letters slipped under doors, the diary entries never shared, the scraps of poetry written on ration cards during war. It began as an act of rebellion, when regimes rewrote the past, erased the names of lovers who didn't fit the narrative. This archive opened its arms. No name was too small, no love too strange. Every story mattered. The keeper read them all. She memorized the letter from a boy to another boy, written beneath the floorboards of a boarding school, where love was forbidden but still bloomed. She wept over the account of a woman who waited 53 years for the return of a man who'd vanished at sea, writing him a letter every week, until her hands no longer worked. She smiled at the note, tucked between the pages of a recipe book, a man's confession of love to the woman, who made him believe in flavor again after grief had dulled everything. These stories were her companions, more real, in some ways, than the people in the city above, who moved too fast to notice the beauty of love that didn't make headlines. Visitors were rare, but one day, a young man came in, lost, breathless, carrying only a backpack and a photograph. "I was told this place keeps memories," he whispered. He showed her a picture of two women, laughing in the rain, a soft city skyline behind them. "My grandmother is on the left, the woman on the right. No one in my family talks about her, but I found their letters. I think they were in love." The keeper led him down the winding hallways, past shelves labeled not by names, but by feeling. First glances, stolen moments, unspoken goodbyes. Finally, they reached a shelf marked, "Those who were almost remembered." There, tucked inside a handmade envelope, was a letter signed in familiar handwriting. "I loved you in the quiet ways, in the pauses between words, in the way I never said goodbye. I still taste the rain on your lips." The young man read it aloud. His voice trembled, not from sadness, but from the recognition of something true. He left the archive with more than a letter. He left with a legacy. And the keeper? She returned to her shelves, to her dust, to her stories. Not all love needs an audience. Some just need to be remembered. So if you ever feel that your love was too quiet, too short, too strange, too secret, know this: It might be resting safely, somewhere, in the archives of forgotten love, waiting for someone gentle enough to find it again. Now, let's move on to the next chapter, when the stars remembered our names. Some say the sky is just a map of fire and emptiness, but there was a time long before clocks, before calendars, when people looked upward not for answers, but for memory, because the stars remembered what people often forgot. They remembered love. This is the story of two souls, not tethered by blood, time, or gravity, but by something gentler, a love that wove itself through constellations. Long ago, on opposite sides of a sleeping world, two children were born beneath the same sky. She, in the heart of a sun-drenched desert, where sand shimmered like gold dust. He, in the belly of a frozen fjord, where silence wrapped around mountains like a prayer. Neither knew the other existed, and yet, on the same night, they both looked up and whispered to the stars. She asked if love could cross great distances. He asked if anyone out there would ever understand his quiet heart. The stars, listening, ancient, luminous, did not answer with words, but they marked those two voices, etched them into memory, named them not as two strangers, but as one story unfolding. Years passed. She became a cartographer of forgotten cities. He, a sculptor of sound composing symphonies from wind and waves. Each alone, yet always sensing something unfinished. Then, one evening, neither old nor young, she arrived in a city she had only seen in dreams. A strange twilight cloaked the buildings. Not dusk, not dawn, a pause in time. And in a quiet corner of a moonlit plaza, he played a melody on a strange-looking instrument, the kind no one made anymore. It was as if the song was remembering itself. She stopped. He looked up. Their eyes met, and something ancient stirred in the sky. A star blinked, as if sighing. Another flared briefly, then settled. The stars remembered. They had sung of this meeting across centuries, of hearts that echoed the same note, even when oceans stood between them. No fireworks, no thunder, just a silence that felt full. He spoke first. "You feel familiar," he said, and she replied, "Like something I once asked the stars to find for me." They spent the night walking the city. No need to ask what came before. The stars had already filled in the spaces. When they returned to the plaza, the stars above shimmered just a little brighter, as if to say, "Yes, this is the story we waited to finish." But stars, for all their wisdom, are also bound by rules. Love like this, threaded through time and light, cannot stay too long in one place. By morning, the city faded, the music quieted, and the two were gone. No one knows where they went. Some say they returned to the sky. Others say they wander between time and dreams, meeting in cities that no map can find. But on certain nights, when the wind carries forgotten music, when the air feels stitched with memory, you might feel them too. A warmth, a pulse, a recognition, as if the stars are leaning a little closer, trying to remember your name too, trying to bring your lost stories home, because the stars don't forget. They just wait for you to look up again.